The day Victor Blackthorne walked into Ridgewater Ranch. He didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed the gate open like a man who already owned everything behind it, his boots leaving deep prints in the dry earth, his two men flanking him like shadows with weight. He stopped in the middle of the yard, looked around at the cracked trough, the sagging fence line, the dust that hadn't moved in weeks, and smiled. Not the kind of smile that meant anything good. The kind that meant he'd already done the math and liked the answer. "Tell Calloway I'm here," he said to no one in particular, loud enough for everyone. "Tell him I've come to help him save what little he has left." Nobody moved, but everyone heard. If you'd been standing in that yard, if that had been your land, your fence, your cracked trough, what would you have done? This is the story of a woman who didn't look away, who counted every number, read every lie, and stood in front of a room full of people who wanted her gone and didn't flinch. If you've ever been told you were too much, or not enough, or simply in the way, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss a single moment of what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really began. The wagon that brought Mara Whitlock to Ridgewater Ranch was not a comfortable one. The driver, a quiet man named Stu who smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, hadn't said more than 6 words since they left the Casper depot. That suited Mara fine. She had nothing left to explain to anyone. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded over the worn leather bag in her lap, the same bag she'd packed and unpacked 4 times in the last 2 months, each time moving somewhere new, each time told, gently or otherwise, that the arrangement wasn't going to work. Her sister-in-law Ruth had used the word practical when she explained why Mara couldn't stay on at the Whitlock farm. Ruth had a gift for dressing up unkind things in neutral language. Practical, as if Mara were a piece of furniture that didn't fit the room. She was 30 years old. She was 5'4", and built, as her late husband Thomas had always said, like a woman who could actually work. He meant it kindly. Most people, when they looked at her, did not. The Wyoming Territory in late September of 1883 had a particular color, tawny and exhausted, like something that had given everything it had and was waiting to see if it would survive the winter. The hills rolled low on either side of the wagon track, the grass beaten flat by a drought that had started in spring and showed no sign of releasing its grip. Mara had grown up in Nebraska. She knew what drought-sick land looked like. She also knew it wasn't dead yet if you knew where to look. Stu pulled the horses to a stop at the top of a shallow rise. Below she could see the ranch. It was not what she'd expected from the advertisement. The ad had described Ridgewater Ranch as a working cattle operation in need of a capable cook and household manager. It had not described the sagging roof on the bunkhouse, or the gap in the fence along the eastern pasture, or the way the whole place had the look of something holding its breath. But it was real, and it was there, and it was hers for now, if the man who owned it decided she was worth keeping. "That's it," Stu said, and clicked his tongue at the horses. They came down the rise and through the gate, and the first person Mara saw was a ranch hand sitting on a fence post, whittling something she couldn't identify. He looked up when the wagon came through. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to the man beside him and said something that made both of them laugh. She heard the word big clearly enough. She was meant to. Mara did not look away. She held the man's gaze until he was the one who looked down at his whittling again, his ears going red at the edges. Small victory. She collected them where she could. Stu pulled the wagon up to the main house and set the brake. Before he could climb down to help her, Mara had already stepped off the wagon bed and landed solidly on the ground, her bag over her shoulder. She straightened her coat and looked at the front door. It opened before she knocked. The man standing in the doorway was taller than she'd imagined from the letter angular, with a jaw that looked like it had been put together from spare parts, and eyes the color of weathered wood. He was somewhere in his early 40s, though hard years had pushed that number upward in his face. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he's been told is sound, but isn't sure he believes it. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. It wasn't quite a greeting. "Mr. Calloway," she answered. It wasn't quite one either. He stepped back to let her through the door. She walked into the house and stopped just inside the entrance, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer light and taking stock of what she was seeing. The front room was functional. The kitchen, visible through the open doorway to the left, was a disaster. Not dirty, exactly someone had made an effort at basic cleanliness, but disordered in the way that happens when no single person is in charge of a space. Shelves stocked with no logic. A pot rack with gaps where hooks had been pulled out and not replaced. A work table with a crack down the center that had been stuffed with a rag to keep it from widening. The kind of kitchen that cooked meals out of obligation rather than intention. "The last woman lasted 3 months, Calloway said behind her. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her take stock. Before that, 6 weeks. Before that, we did without. What happened to them? Mara asked. One got married. One went back east. He paused. One said the work was too hard. Is it? He looked at her for a moment. It's Wyoming territory in a dry year. Make of that what you will. She set her bag down on the work table next to the cracked seam. I'll need a full inventory of what's in the larder. And I'll want to look at the supply accounts before the end of the week. He frowned slightly. You're a cook. I'm a cook who doesn't like surprises, she said. A ranch this size runs through supplies on a schedule. I want to know what that schedule looks like before I set mine. He considered her for a moment longer than was comfortable. I'll have Billy show you to your room, he said finally. Supper's expected at 6. It'll be ready, Mara said. It was. And it was better than anything that kitchen had produced in at least 2 years, though she didn't know that yet. She would find out later, from one of the older ranch hands, a quiet man named Cy, who'd been at Ridgewater long enough to remember what it had looked like when it was running well. He told her, about a week in, that he hadn't tasted biscuits like that since Calloway's wife was still alive. She hadn't known the man had a wife. Nobody had mentioned it. She filed that away with everything else she was collecting. The first week at Ridgewater was a process of learning what the place actually was versus what it appeared to be. On the surface, a cattle ranch in dry time, stretched thin, understaffed by 2 hands who'd left in July and hadn't been replaced, getting by on reduced ambition and stubbornness. Below the surface, and Mara was always looking below the surface, something else. The kitchen accounts were kept in a battered ledger in the top drawer of the desk in Calloway's office, and he gave her access to them without much comment when she asked. She suspected he expected her to look at the food columns and leave the rest alone. She did not leave the rest alone. She sat at the kitchen table those first evenings, after the dishes were washed and the hands were settled, and went through the numbers. Column by column, month by month. She was methodical about it. Thomas had always joked that she approached a ledger the way other women approached a quilting pattern, looking for where the pieces didn't line up right. By the 3rd evening, she'd found 3 discrepancies. By the 5th, she'd found 11. They weren't large individually. A few dollars here, a short count there. Supplies logged as delivered that came in underweight or undercount. Could have been error. It could have been the kind of sloppiness that accumulated in a stretched operation. But it wasn't random. The pattern was too consistent. Always the same suppliers. Always just below the threshold where a busy man would stop and question it. She didn't say anything yet. She kept the ledger entries in a small notebook she bought at the general store in town when she rode in with Billy for the weekly supply run. She wrote in a hand that was small and precise, the way Thomas had taught her, clear enough to read in court, he used to say, if it ever came to that. She hadn't thought much about courts until now. The ranch hands were harder to read than the ledger. There were 7 of them, full-time, plus 2 seasonal men who showed up when there was extra work and disappeared again. The full-timers divided roughly into 2 camps, the ones who'd watched enough women come and go that they didn't invest much in her being there, and the ones who'd decided to make her uncomfortable enough to leave on her own. The man she'd locked eyes with on her first day was named Holt. He was 35 or thereabouts, good-looking in a way that he'd used to his advantage long enough that it had become a kind of laziness. He made comments, not loud ones, not anything that could be directly confronted, but the kind of quiet remarks to the men nearby that were designed to carry just far enough. She caught she needs 2 horses on her 2nd day. She caught wonder what she ate to get like that on her 4th. She didn't respond to either of them directly. What she did was cook. She cooked the way she'd learned on Thomas's farm, practically, efficiently, without waste, with enough care that people noticed. She worked out which men liked what, remembered it without being told twice, and made the kitchen a place where the quality of the food was not something anyone could credibly complain about. One of the seasonal men, a young hand named Drew, told her it was the best food he'd had since his mother's table. She thanked him and gave him an extra biscuit. Cy, the older hand, started sitting at the kitchen table in the mornings with his coffee instead of the bunkhouse. He didn't say much, he didn't have to. His presence was its own kind of endorsement. Holt noticed. He didn't like it. 3 weeks in, Mara was restocking the flour bins from the sacks Billy had brought back from town when she noticed the weight was off. She had asked for 3 50-pound sacks. The receipt said 3 50-pound sacks. But when she lifted the first one, then the second, then the third, they were light. Not by much. But she'd been lifting 50-pound sacks of flour since she was 16. She knew the difference. She brought the kitchen scale out from the pantry, the old brass one Thomas had given her when they were married because, as he said, a kitchen scale is the most honest thing in a house. She weighed all 3 sacks. 41 pounds, 43 pounds, 40 pounds. She wrote it down. Then she went back through the ledger and checked every flour delivery for the past 6 months. The pattern was there. Every delivery, short by somewhere between 5 and 12 pounds per sack. Over 6 months, across all the supplies showing similar patterns, the losses added up to somewhere between $60 and $80. Not enough to sink a ranch, enough to bleed it. She brought the notebook to Ethan Calloway that evening after supper. He was in his office, which was a room that looked like it had given up on being organized sometime around 1880, and made peace with the outcome. He had a glass of whiskey at his elbow and a letter in his hand that he set down when she appeared in the doorway. "Something wrong with the food," he said. "The food's fine," she said. She walked in, which she could tell slightly surprised him. Previous cooks, he'd told her once, had stayed out of the office. She set the notebook on the desk in front of him and opened it to the first page. "This is wrong." He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "What is this?" "Your accounts," she said. "Or rather, what's missing from them." She sat down in the chair across the desk without being invited, which she could tell surprised him more. "Your supply deliveries have been running short for at least 6 months. Possibly longer. I'd need to see older ledgers to know how far back it goes. The amounts per delivery are small enough that they wouldn't jump out at you unless you were looking for the pattern." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the notebook and read through her entries slowly. She watched his face. He had the kind of face that didn't move much when he was thinking, but something shifted in his jaw, tightening, she read, as the particular discomfort of a man who was beginning to believe something he didn't want to believe. "Could be measurement error," he said. "It could be," she agreed, "if it was random." "It's not random. Same supply, same pattern every month. Consistent enough that someone is making sure the losses stay just under what would set off an alarm." He set the notebook down. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the sound of the men in the bunkhouse, the low murmur of conversation, someone laughing at something. "You've been here 3 weeks, he said. "Yes," she said. "And you found this in 3 weeks." "I was looking," she said simply. "Your previous cooks probably weren't." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at the notebook. "How bad is it?" "In flour and grain alone, you've been shorted roughly $40 over 6 months, she said. "That's what I can document so far. I think it's broader than that, and I think it goes further back than my records show. But I wanted to bring you what I have rather than wait until I have everything." "Why?" She considered the question. "Because if someone is doing this deliberately, the longer they don't know they've been caught, the better." That got through. She could see it. He leaned back in his chair and ran one hand over the lower half of his face in a gesture she was beginning to recognize as what he did when he was rearranging his picture of something. "Who else knows about this?" he asked. "No one," she said. "I thought you should see it first." He nodded slowly. "I'll look at the older ledgers." "Good," she said. She stood up and picked up the notebook. "I'll make a separate copy for you. More legible than the original. I write fast when I'm working." She was at the door when he spoke again. "Mrs. Whitlock." She turned. He looked at her with something she couldn't immediately name, not quite respect, because he wasn't there yet, but the beginning of a recalibration. The look of a man who has been measuring something against the wrong ruler and is beginning to suspect it. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once and went back to the kitchen. She had bread dough to check on before she turned in, and a full set of supply records to cross-reference in the morning. There wasn't time to feel much about what had just happened, but on her way down the hallway, she let herself acknowledge it. Quietly, she had been seen. Not as an inconvenient size or an unwanted obligation or a body that took up too much space on a wagon seat. She had been seen as the person who had found something no one else had bothered to find. Wasn't everything, but it was a start. The next morning, she rose at 4:30 as she always did, started the stove fire, and had coffee ready before any of the hands came in from the bunkhouse. Cy arrived first as usual, pulled his chair out with the quiet familiarity of a man who'd decided something was his and wasn't giving it back. "Sleep all right?" he asked. "Well enough," she said. She poured his coffee. "How long have you been at Ridgewater?" 11 years, he said. "Give or take, long time," she said. "It is," he agreed. He wrapped both hands around the cup. It was a different place, 11 years ago. She waited. She'd learned with Cy that he talked in his own time, and waiting was the correct response to almost everything he said. "Calloway's wife, her name was Ellen. She kept things sharp," he said after a moment. "She died 4 years back, fever." After that, he shrugged. "Things drifted. He's a good man, but he's not a details man. Never was. Ellen was the one who watched the numbers, and no one's been watching them since." Cy looked at her over his coffee cup. "Not until lately," he said. He wasn't subtle about what he meant. She didn't pretend he was. "Is there anyone on the ranch you don't trust?" she asked. It was a direct question, and she knew it. He would either answer or he wouldn't. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't. Then he said, "Holt's been here 2 years." Came with a reference from Gideon Briggs. She filed that name carefully. Gideon Briggs was the primary supplier for Ridgewater, the man whose name appeared on most of the delivery receipts she'd been tracking. She hadn't said his name to Cy. She hadn't said any names. Good to know, she said. She didn't ask anything else. But that morning, when she added another entry to her notebook, she wrote Holt Briggs connection in the margin and underlined it once. The second week of October brought a cold front down from the north that pushed temperatures below freezing overnight and made the mornings feel like something personal. The ranch hands wore their coats to breakfast, which they hadn't had to do yet, and the conversation around the table had the hunched, inward quality of people bracing for what was coming. Calloway had looked at the older ledgers. He came to find her the morning after he'd spent 2 evenings going through them, and his face told her what he'd found before he said a word. 4 years, he said. He stood in the kitchen doorway, hat in hand, turning it slowly. At least, she nodded. Maybe longer, he said. Some of the ledgers before that he stopped. Ellen kept the accounts. When she was gone, I thought I was keeping them. I wasn't keeping them the way she did. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say about that. How much? He asked. Rough estimate, based on what I can verify. She set down the spoon she'd been using to stir the morning's pot and gave him her full attention. Over 4 years, across supplies, probably $300 to $400 in deliberate shortfalls. And that's only what I can document with the records we have. If the missing weight extended to cattle, she paused. Are your cattle counts accurate? His jaw did the thing again. I believe they were. When did you last count them yourself? The silence that followed was the kind that answered the question better than words would have. I'd like to take a look at the sales records, she said. If that's all right. It's all right, he said. The sales records were in a different ledger, one that lived in a box under the desk rather than in the drawer. She spent 3 evenings going through it. By the end of the 3rd evening, she had a new problem. Not just the supply losses. Something in the cattle counts didn't reconcile. Animals recorded as sold that, when she mapped the numbers against what the pasture could reasonably carry, and the feed account showed going out, had either never been there or had never been sold. She laid it all out in a second notebook. She was beginning to fill notebooks at a pace that would have surprised her 3 months ago. She was deep in the second ledger late on a Thursday evening, the kitchen quiet around her, the fire banked low, when she heard footsteps outside the window. Not the bunkhouse, this was the side yard, where there wasn't much reason for anyone to be after dark. She sat still and listened. The footsteps stopped. A moment later they moved away. She went to the window and looked out, but there was only the dark and the wind moving through the dry grass. She stood there for a moment longer than she probably needed to, and then she went back to her notebooks. She didn't sleep particularly well that night, but she kept working. What she was beginning to understand, and what she didn't yet have enough to say aloud, was that the ranch's collapse wasn't purely about drought and hard times. Those things were real. They'd hurt Ridgewater the way they'd hurt every other operation in the territory that year. But they hadn't caused the kind of quiet, sustained bleed she was looking at in these numbers. Something had been feeding on Ridgewater for years carefully, in amounts designed not to be noticed. And whoever was doing it had been patient enough to wait for a man who was grieving and distracted, and not watching his numbers the way he should have been in. That kind of patience wasn't opportunistic. That was a plan. She wrote that in the margin of her second notebook. Not evidence, just a word. Plan, she circled it and kept going. By the end of the second week of October, she had 3 things she was reasonably certain of: that the supply shortfalls were deliberate and connected to Gideon Briggs's delivery operation, that the cattle records had been manipulated to obscure losses she couldn't yet fully quantify, and that Holt, who had been oddly interested in what she did with her evenings, who she'd caught more than once hovering near the kitchen after dinner under various thin pretexts, had some connection to Briggs that predated his arrival at Ridgewater. She was not certain of the 4th thing, but she was beginning to suspect it, and the suspicion, once she let herself name it, was large enough to change the shape of everything she'd been looking at. Someone wasn't just stealing from Ridgewater. Someone was trying to break it. Not all at once. Not dramatically. The way you'd drain a man in a long desert, crossing slow enough that he doesn't realize how thirsty he is until he can't stand up anymore. Steal enough, undermine enough, and then wait for him to come to you. Come to who, she didn't know yet. But she wrote down what she did know. Every ranch in a 50-mile radius had had a hard year. Several had already sold. She'd overheard Cy mentioning it, and one of the other hands confirming that 3 ranchers to the west had taken offers on their land in the past 8 months. Good offers, apparently, surprisingly good for drought land. She wrote down the name of the man who'd made those offers, which she'd heard mentioned once at the general store and again at the feed yard. Victor Blackthorne. She wrote it down, circled it once, and sat there looking at it for a long moment. Outside, the wind pushed hard against the kitchen window. The fire had burned low. She was alone at the table with 2 notebooks full of numbers that pointed toward something larger and uglier than she'd originally thought. In a territory she barely knew, in a house where the man who owned it was only beginning to believe she was someone worth listening to. She closed both notebooks, banked the fire, and went to bed. She lay in the dark listening to the Wyoming wind and thought about Thomas. He'd been a careful man, careful with money, careful with land, careful with records. He'd taught her that the numbers always told a story, if you were patient enough to read them. He hadn't taught her what to do when the story they told was one this size. She'd have to work that out herself. She turned on her side, pulled the blanket up, and made herself go to sleep. Tomorrow she had bread to start before dawn, accounts to review, and at least one more question to ask Cy when the moment was right. She was 30 years old. She was wide awake in a stranger's house in a drought year in the Wyoming Territory, chasing a thread that might lead somewhere dangerous. She was also, for the first time, in longer than she could clearly remember, doing something that mattered. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't safe. But it felt, in a way she didn't try to put into better words than this. Exactly right. The next delivery from Gideon Briggs was scheduled for a Tuesday, which gave Mara 4 days to prepare. She didn't tell Calloway everything she was planning. She told him enough. That she wanted to be present when the supplies came in, that she wanted to count everything herself, and that she needed him to let her do it without interference. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her more often lately, like a man who wasn't sure whether to be impressed or unsettled, and had decided to split the difference. Briggs won't like it, he said. No, she agreed. He won't. He was quiet for a moment then. All right. She spent those 4 days, finishing her second notebook and starting a third. She went back through the cattle records. With Cy's help, he knew those numbers better than anyone, having worked the pastures for over a decade, and by the end of the second day, she had a figure. Not exact, close enough. 43 head, she said, sitting across from Cy at the kitchen table. The ledger opened between them and her notebook beside it. Over 4 years. That's the minimum the numbers don't account for. Could be higher. Cy looked at the columns she'd laid out. He was a man who took his time with things, who didn't speak until he'd finished thinking, and she'd come to respect that about him. He went through her comparisons slowly, tracing the lines with one calloused finger. I thought we were losing to the dry years, he said finally. Cattle drift. Disease. I put numbers down to losses I couldn't account for, and told myself that was ranching. Someone wanted you to believe that, she said. He looked up. You think this goes further than Briggs. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. I think Briggs is a part of it. Maybe a willing part. Maybe not. I don't know enough yet to say which. But the supply shortfalls alone don't explain the cattle numbers. Those records were altered deliberately. She paused. And I think it was done by someone who knew this ranch well enough to know what alterations wouldn't be noticed. Cy sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long time and she let him be. Holt keeps the cattle counts in the field, he said. Has done since about 2.5 years back. Before that it was me. But my knees got bad for a season, and Calloway asked Holt to take it over. I never went back to it. Mara wrote nothing down. She already knew that. But hearing it from Cy made it different, heavier, somehow. More real in the way that things become real, when someone else says them aloud for the first time. You should tell Calloway, Cy said. I will, she said. After Tuesday. She needed Tuesday first. She needed to see Briggs catch himself in his own pattern, in front of Ethan Calloway, with no way to explain it away as sloppiness or scale error. She needed Calloway to see it with his own eyes. Because she knew, had known from the first evening she'd walked into his office with her notebook, that what he believed and what he could be told were not always the same thing. He was a man who trusted what he'd witnessed over what he'd been shown on paper, even if the paper was correct. That wasn't stubbornness exactly. That was how he'd survived a hard life in a hard territory, by not accepting things at face value. She intended to use it. Tuesday came in cold and clear. The delivery wagon came up the road at 9:30. The same time it always did. Briggs was, if nothing else, punctual. He was a square-built man in his mid-50s, with a face that had the practiced openness of someone who'd made a career out of appearing trustworthy. He wore a good coat and kept his boots clean, which were details Mara had learned to distrust in a supply man. The honest ones wore whatever was practical. He pulled up to the supply barn and began calling out to the hands in the yard with the comfortable ease of a man on familiar ground. Then he saw Mara standing at the barn door with a scale, a notebook, and an expression that gave him nothing. His step slowed, only slightly, but she caught it. Morning, he said, addressing the space slightly to her left, toward where Billy was standing. Bigger crew today? Mrs. Whitlock manages the kitchen accounts now, Calloway said, from where he'd positioned himself near the fence. He'd taken her advice to the letter on this one, which surprised her. Be here. Don't stand too close. Let her do it. He looked relaxed. He wasn't, she could tell by the angle of his shoulders. but he looked it, and that was what mattered. Briggs smiled at her. The smile had a practiced quality, warm around the edges, nothing behind it. Always good to see the household running organized, he said. What can I help you with, ma'am? I'll take the flour first, she said, if you have it ready. Of course. He nodded to his man on the wagon. The sacks came off. Mara weighed each one. She did it carefully, making no show of ceremony, writing down each number as she went. She didn't announce anything. She didn't make a face. She just weighed and wrote, moving at the pace of someone who had all the time in the world and intended to use it. By the fourth sack, Briggs was talking, filling the silence with the kind of comfortable chatter that supply men used to make everyone around them feel at ease. The weather, the road conditions, a piece of news from town he'd heard at the feed yard. She let it wash past her. She kept weighing. When she'd finished the flour, she moved to the grain, then the salt, then the dried beans. She checked every lot against the manifest. She wrote down every number. Briggs had stopped talking by the time she reached the beans. When she was finished, she closed her notebook and looked at Calloway. The manifest says 412 pounds of flour across 8 sacks, she said. I'm counting 361 pounds. The grain is 48 pounds short across 4 sacks. The salt is correct. She paused. The beans I haven't completed yet, but at the current rate, I'd estimate they're short by a similar proportion. The yard was quiet. One of the hands who drifted over to watch had the decency to look at the ground. Billy was very still. Briggs's smile didn't collapse exactly. It reconfigured. Became something tighter, more careful. Scales can vary, he said. Road travel, the jostling. I used this scale 3 days ago to weigh our current stock, Mara said. It was accurate then. I tested it this morning against a known weight before you arrived. It's accurate now, ma'am. I don't know what you think. I think your sacks are short, she said, by a consistent and not insignificant amount. And I think this has been happening for some time. She said it without heat, without drama. The way she'd say that the bread wasn't done yet is simple fact, stated plainly, not for argument. Briggs looked at Calloway. Calloway looked back at him with the expression of a man who has just had a very large and uncomfortable thing confirmed. I'd like to see your weight records, he said, from the mill. I don't carry those on the wagon. Then I'd like them by end of week, Calloway said. Mara, finish the count. She finished it. The beans were short by 19 pounds. She wrote it down. Briggs left without his usual cup of coffee at the kitchen table, which Cy later told her had been a consistent part of his routine for 3 years. Nobody offered it to him. He drove his wagon back down the road, and Mara watched him go from the barn door, and she thought, he's going to tell someone. Not because he'd decided to come clean, because that was what men like Briggs did when the pattern was interrupted. They reported upward. The question was who was above him. She thought she already knew the answer, but she wasn't ready to say it yet. Ethan Calloway came to find her an hour after Briggs left. She was back in the kitchen, making a list of what they'd actually received so she could plan the week's meals around the correct quantities rather than the manifest numbers. He sat down across from her without being invited, which was new. He'd always waited to be acknowledged before taking a seat in her kitchen, as if he wasn't sure whether the space was his or hers. I've known Gideon Briggs for 7 years, he said. I know, she said. She didn't look up from her list. I bought him a drink when his son was born. He said it like a fact he was examining from all sides, turning it over to see if it changed shape. He showed me the baby at the church social. People aren't always what they seem to us, she said, especially people who need us to trust them. He was quiet. She heard him exhale not quite a sigh, more like something releasing. Cattle numbers, he said. Yes, you were going to tell me after today. Yes. He looked at her notebook, which was closed on the table between them. Tell me now, she told him. She laid it out the same way she'd laid out the supply shortfalls, without drama, with numbers, following the logic from one figure to the next. She told him about the 43 head that the records couldn't account for. She told him about the pattern in the alteration, the way the numbers had been adjusted, just enough to look like natural losses, just below what would trigger a formal audit. She told him about the timeline, which put the start of the cattle record irregularities at roughly 2.5 years back. She did not tell him about Holt. Not yet. She let him reach for it himself. He got there. She could see it happen, the slow assembly of things he'd been keeping in separate places in his mind, which were now refusing to stay separate. The cattle counts, he said. Holt took those over. About 2.5 years ago, she said. Yes. He stood up abruptly, chair scraping. Went to the window. Stood there with his back to her and one hand flat on the wall. She waited. I hired him, he said, based on a reference from Briggs. I know. He seemed stopped. Tried again. He's good with the horses. Good in the field. He turned around. His face was doing the thing it did when he was angry, going very still, the jaw tight, everything compressed. Is he in on this? I don't know, she said honestly. He may be actively part of it, or he may have been positioned there to facilitate access for someone else without fully understanding the scope. I don't have enough to say which. She paused. But I think you shouldn't let him know what we've found. Not yet. Why? Because if he reports to Briggs and Briggs reports further up, she let that hang in the air between them, came back to the table and sat down. He looked at her with something that had moved well past the beginning of respect she'd seen that first evening in his office. This was different. This was the look of a man who was realizing for the first time how lucky he was that a particular wagon had come through a particular gate on a particular afternoon in late September. Further up, he said, "You think this is bigger than Briggs? The supply shortfalls would benefit Briggs directly. They're his deliveries, his operation, he pockets the difference between what the mill charges and what he delivers." She kept her voice even. "But the cattle record alterations, those benefit someone who's positioned to buy struggling land. The losses make the ranch look worse than it is. They accelerate the financial pressure. They create conditions where a man might be willing to accept an offer on his property that he wouldn't otherwise accept." Calloway didn't say anything. He was watching her face. "3 ranches west of here have sold in the past 8 months, she said. To Victor Blackthorne. The name landed. She watched it land. "Blackthorne," he said. His voice was flat. "You know him. Everyone knows him. He's stopped. He's on the county land board. He's been pushing to establish better water rights frameworks for the whole territory. He's considered." He stopped again. The word he'd been about to use appeared to have become unavailable to him. "Expected," she supplied. "Yes, I'm not accusing him of anything," she said carefully. "I'm telling you what the numbers suggest and what the pattern of land purchases looks like from where I'm sitting. I could be wrong about the connection. I could be right and unable to prove it. What I can prove, with what I have right now, is that your supply deliveries have been deliberately short for at least 4 years, that your cattle records have been manipulated, and that at least one person currently employed on this ranch has a prior relationship with the man responsible for the supply fraud." She stopped talking. She let him have the room. He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up again, a dry, insistent sound that she'd stopped finding ominous and had started treating as background. "What do I do?" he said. It wasn't the question she'd expected. She'd expected anger or argument or the instinct to act that she'd noticed in him when he was pushed the forward lean of a man whose first response to a problem was to confront it directly. Instead, what she got was something more honest. A man who was in water over his head and knew it. "Right now," she said. "Nothing that tips your hand. You need the original weight records from the mill, not what Briggs brings, but what the mill itself has on file. If his deliveries have been consistently short, the mill's records won't match his manifests. That's a paper trail that doesn't depend on my scale or my word." He nodded. "You also need to find out if your land survey is current," she said. "Water rights, property boundaries, anything that could be contested. If someone is building toward acquiring this land, the groundwork might already be happening." He looked at her sharply. "Why would the land survey matter?" "Because land fraud usually isn't just one thing," she said. "The cattle losses make you financially weak. The supply fraud makes you financially weaker. A contested water right, especially in a drought year, makes you desperate enough to sell." She paused. "You don't take a man's land by force. You take it by making him believe he has no other choice." The room was very quiet. Calloway stood up again slowly this time, not the abrupt movement of a moment ago. He picked up her notebook from the table and held it. "Can I keep this?" he said. "That's your copy," she said. "I have the originals." He looked down at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I want you to know something," he said. She waited. "When my foreman telegraphed to say a widow from Nebraska was answering the Cook advertisement, a widow, he said, who was rather—" He stopped, visibly uncomfortable. "He described you in terms that were not—" "I can imagine," she said. "I almost wired back to turn you away," he said. He said it with the blunt discomfort of someone forcing themselves to be honest about a thing they're not proud of. "I thought I don't know what I thought. Something unkind. Something I'm not going to say aloud." She kept her face neutral. "But you didn't wire back." "No," he said. "I needed a cook too badly to be particular." She almost smiled at that. The honesty of it unvarnished, not trying to make itself prettier than it was. "Well," she said, "here we both are." "Here we both are," he agreed. He tucked the notebook under his arm. At the kitchen door, he paused. "I'm going to ride to the county seat at the end of the week," he said, "to look at the land registry." "Good," she said. "I'd like you to come." She looked up from her list. "All right," she said. After he left, she sat alone in the kitchen for a while, without writing anything. The fire was steady. The wind was steady. She thought about the weight of what was now in motion, not just the supply fraud, not just the cattle records, but the larger shape she'd named aloud to him for the first time. The shape that included Victor Blackthorne, which was a name with real weight in this territory, a name attached to money and influence, and the particular kind of local power that insulated itself with respectability. She thought about what it meant to go after a name like that, with a notebook full of numbers and a brass kitchen scale. She also thought practically about the bread she still needed to start. She got up and got the flour from the bin, measuring carefully, as she always did, from the actual supply rather than what the manifest claimed was there. She worked the dough by hand, the way she'd learned to do it at 15, her arms finding the familiar rhythm. It helped her think. It always had. By Thursday, Calloway had sent a man to the mill in Casper with a letter requesting the original weight logs for all Ridgewater deliveries over the past 3 years. The man Calloway sent was not Billy, who had a friendly relationship with Briggs's operation that Mara thought warranted watching. He sent Cy, with instructions to wait for the records in person and bring them back without stopping anywhere on the road. Cy left before dawn on Thursday and was back by Saturday evening, his saddlebags heavy with copied logs the mill bookkeeper had provided. Mara spent Saturday night at the kitchen table with those logs in her notebooks. Calloway sat with her for 2 hours before fatigue took him to bed, but she kept going after he left, comparing figures, building a column of actual versus claimed deliveries that went back 3 years. The discrepancy over 3 years of documented deliveries was $473. That was Briggs's take. Just from the supply shortfalls documented, not the cattle, not anything else. She wrote the figure at the top of a clean page in her notebook, underlined it twice and stared at it for a long moment. $473 was not a rounding error. It was not sloppiness or imprecision. It was a sustained, deliberate extraction from a man who was already struggling, designed to compound a drought-year difficulty into something that looked like irreversible failure. She thought about Ellen Calloway, who had died 4 years ago, who had watched the numbers, who, had she lived, would have caught this inside of a month. She thought about the timing. Then she stopped thinking about the timing, because it led somewhere she couldn't go with the evidence she had. And she'd learned from Thomas that the worst thing you could do with a partial pattern was to fill in the gaps with what you suspected rather than what you knew. She closed the notebooks and went to bed. Sunday was cold enough that the water in the trough had a thin skin of ice on it by morning, which the ranch hands broke through with practiced indifference. Mara made a large pot of oatmeal with dried apple and a pan of cornbread alongside the usual eggs, and the kitchen was warm and crowded in the way she'd come to find grounding. 8 men, who'd started the month treating her as a temporary inconvenience, had developed, over 6 weeks, the habit of coming to breakfast a little early if they could manage it, which was not something she pointed out but privately noted. Holt came late. He usually did on Sundays. He came in, filled his plate, and sat at the far end of the table in his usual spot, and Mara went about her business without looking at him any differently than she looked at anyone else. She'd gotten good at that. After breakfast, while the hands were heading out to their Sunday maintenance tasks, she caught something she wasn't meant to see. Holt, near the corner of the supply barn, talking to a man she didn't recognize, lean, in a dark coat, on a horse she hadn't seen in the yard before. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. The man on the horse did most of the talking. Holt stood with his arms crossed and his head slightly down, the posture of someone receiving instructions, not exchanging information as equals. When the man rode off, Holt went directly to the bunkhouse without looking around. Mara went back into the kitchen and wrote down everything she'd seen, including a description of the man on the horse and the direction he'd ridden from when he arrived and toward when he left. The direction he'd ridden out was east, toward the road that eventually connected to the Blackthorn operation. She didn't draw a conclusion from that. She wrote down what she'd seen. She was still at the table when Calloway came through the kitchen door. 20 minutes later, wind burned from his morning rounds, pulling off his gloves. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She told him. He listened without sitting down, one glove still in his hand. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The land registry office is closed Sunday," he said. "We ride Monday morning." "Yes," she said. He went to the door, then stopped. He turned back with the expression she'd started recognizing as the one that preceded something difficult, the look of a man making himself say the thing he'd rather leave unsaid. "My wife used to sit at that table," he said, "with numbers. Like that." He indicated the notebooks with a gesture that wasn't quite pointing. I thought the detail of it was more than was necessary. That she fussed over things that didn't need fussing." Mara said nothing. "I was wrong," he said. He left before she could respond, which was probably deliberate. She looked back at her notebooks. Outside, the wind moved across the yard, same as it always did. Territory didn't change for anyone's realizations. Kept going. But something had changed in the house. Subtly, the way things changed when a long-held misunderstanding was finally corrected, not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just the quiet shift of two people who were beginning to understand what they actually were to each other, which was neither simple nor what either of them had expected when the wagon had come through the gate 6 weeks ago. She pulled a fresh page in her notebook and began organizing what they had. She wanted it clean and orderly before Monday, before the land registry, before whatever came next, because she was increasingly certain that whatever came next was going to be harder than what had come before, and she intended to be ready for it. The question she kept coming back to, turning it over in the quiet of the kitchen while the fire burned steady and the wind pressed against the glass, was not whether she could prove what she suspected about Victor Blackthorne. She thought she could. Not yet, not with what she had right now, but the shape of it was becoming visible. The way the shape of a figure becomes visible before you can make out the face. Question was what a man like Blackthorne would do when he realized someone was looking. She wrote the question down in the margin of the last page. Then she closed the notebook, stacked it with the others, and started thinking about what to make for Monday's breakfast, because the men had a cold ride ahead of them, and they'd need something that stayed with them. And that was the kind of problem she knew exactly how to solve. The land registry office in Clearwater County was a single room attached to the side of the county clerk's building, staffed by a thin man named Ostergaard, who wore a green eyeshade and treated every inquiry as a personal imposition. He looked at Mara when she and Calloway came through the door, the way people looked at things that didn't belong where they'd appeared. And then he looked at Calloway, and then he sighed, the sigh of a man who had hoped for a quiet Monday. Ridgewater Ranch, Calloway said. I want to see the current survey and any filings against the water rights in the past 3 years. Ostergaard pulled the file without comment. He set it on the counter and went back to his desk. Mara read it standing up, which she preferred. Calloway stood beside her. The original survey was there, the boundary markers, the creek rights, the documentation of the water access that ran along the eastern edge of the Ridgewater property, which in a drought year was worth more than the cattle and the buildings combined. She went through it page by page, looking for what she'd started to suspect. She found it on page 7. It was a notation, a small amendment recorded 14 months ago, referencing a boundary dispute filing by a neighboring property. The neighboring property was identified by parcel number, not by name. But when she asked Ostergaard to cross-reference the parcel number, and he did it with the martyred patience of a man who was being forced to work, the name that came back was not a neighboring rancher. It was a landholding company, registered 6 years ago. Principal officer listed as a name she didn't recognize. She wrote it down. Then she asked Ostergaard to look up the registered agent for the landholding company. He found it in a secondary registry book. The registered agent was an attorney in Casper named Fenton. She wrote that down too. Who uses Fenton? She asked Calloway quietly, while Ostergaard was putting the books away. Half the territory, he said. He's one of 3 attorneys in the county. Does Blackthorne use him? Calloway looked at her. I don't know, he said. But his voice had the particular flatness of a man who thought he might. She took careful copies of every relevant page in the file. Ostergaard charged her 15 cents for the paper and the use of his pen, which she paid without argument. On the ride back to Ridgewater, she and Calloway didn't talk much. The road was cold and the wind was lateral, and conversation required more effort than either of them had to spare. But somewhere in the last mile before the ranch gate, Calloway said, without preamble, I'm going to ask around about Fenton. Carefully, she said. I know how to ask carefully, he said. She thought he probably did in his own way, which might not be exactly her way, but it was something. What came back in the following days was not surprising exactly, but it was the kind of confirmation that sat differently in the stomach than suspicion does. Calloway had a friend, a rancher 2 counties over, named Pete Aldred, a man he'd known since they were both young and stupid and working other men's cattle, who had crossed paths with Blackthorne's legal operation during a boundary dispute 2 years prior. Aldred hadn't thought much of it at the time. But when Calloway described the landholding company and the Fenton connection, Aldred told him that the same company name had appeared in his own dispute, on the opposing side, arguing for a boundary reinterpretation that would have cut off his south pasture water access. Aldred had won his case, but only barely, and only because his original survey was unambiguous. He'd assumed at the time it was opportunistic lawyering by a neighbor with money to spend. He no longer assumed that. Mara added it to the notebooks. She had 4 notebooks now. She'd started organizing them by category: supply fraud, cattle records, land filing, personnel, because the volume of information had outgrown any single organizing system. She kept them in the locked box she'd asked Calloway to provide after the night she'd heard footsteps outside the kitchen window, which felt both like a long time ago and not long enough. The rumor started in the 2nd week of November. She didn't know exactly when it began, because rumors in small communities don't announce themselves, they accumulate, the way sediment does. until you notice one day that the water isn't clear anymore. The first indication she had was a change in how people at the general store treated her on the supply run. Not rude, exactly, a certain distance. Eyes that slid away. A conversation that stopped when she walked into the dry goods section and didn't resume the way it would have a week earlier. Told herself it might be nothing. She'd been an outsider in this community from the first day, and she'd made peace with the particular coolness that extended to people who weren't from here. But the following week, when she rode into town for the mail order, the woman at the post office, a Mrs. Garfield, who had been briskly pleasant since Mara's first visit, handed her Ridgewater's post without making eye contact. And on the way out of the post office, she heard, clearly enough to leave no room for interpretation, someone behind her say to someone else, "That's her, the one who's been messing with Calloway's books." She stopped walking. She considered turning around. She kept walking. In the wagon on the way back, Sai said, "You heard that?" "Yes," she said. "People are saying things," he said. He had the look of a man who'd already heard more than he wanted to and was trying to decide how much to tell her. "I've been hearing it for a week. I didn't want to say anything until I knew more." "What are they saying?" He was quiet for a moment. "That you came here from Nebraska with some scheme. That you've been falsifying Calloway's accounts, not catching someone else doing it, but doing it yourself, to make yourself seem necessary, to get your hooks into the ranch." He paused, and into Calloway. She looked at the road ahead. The sky was flat and white the way it got before snow that didn't come. "Where's it coming from?" she asked. "Can't get a clear source," he said. "You know how it is. People just know things, and nobody remembers exactly how they started knowing them." She knew exactly how it was. She'd seen it happen before, in smaller ways, in the Nebraska community where she and Thomas had lived. The particular efficiency of a lie that confirmed what people already half believed. She was an outsider. She was a woman with no family claim on this land, no history here, no name that meant anything. She had come in and immediately started rearranging things. To people who wanted to believe something unflattering about her, the narrative of a scheming woman manipulating a grieving widower's finances was not a difficult sell. "Calloway needs to know," Sai said. "I'll tell him tonight," she said. She did. She sat across from him in his office and told him exactly what she'd heard and what Sai had told her, keeping her voice even, watching his face. He went through several expressions in the space of a few minutes, disbelief first, then anger, then something controlled and deliberate that she'd learned meant he was making himself slow down before he acted. "People who know this ranch know better," he said. "People who know this ranch aren't the concern," she said. "Concern is the larger community. The people who'll be in the room when this eventually has to be settled publicly. Nobody's going anywhere publicly. Ethan." She used his first name for the first time, which she registered only after she'd done it. His expression shifted slightly, not displeasure, just noticing. "Whoever is behind this isn't going to let us present evidence quietly. They're going to need to control the room when it comes out. This rumor is part of that. If people already believe I'm the problem, then anything I show them becomes suspect." He looked at her for a long moment. "You think it's blackthorn?" "I think it has the shape of someone who's done this before," she said. "Yes." He looked at the notebooks on his desk. She'd brought 2 of them to show him the new material from the land registry. "What do we do? Keep collecting what we have," she said, "and be ready." She went to bed that night with the deliberate consciousness of a woman who was choosing not to be afraid of what was coming, because being afraid wouldn't help anyone, and she'd run out of energy for unhelpful emotions somewhere around the age of 24. But she lay awake longer than usual, listening to the wind, and she let herself be honest. This was the part she hadn't prepared for. The numbers she could handle. The evidence she could build. The rumors, the quiet corrosion of other people's trust that was different. That didn't have a column you could check against a manifest. She thought about the morning she'd stood in Ruth's kitchen while Ruth explained, practically, why the arrangement wasn't working. Ruth had used the word disruptive. Too much presence, too much opinion, too much of everything. At the time, Mara had thought it was personal that Ruth simply didn't like her, which was probably also true. But now she recognized the more general form of it, the particular hostility that gathered around a woman who occupied space without apology. Who counted things? Who didn't defer when the math said she was right? She was used to it, she just hadn't expected it to arrive this fast, or this organized. 3 days later, a letter was slid under the kitchen door sometime before dawn. She found it when she came down to start the stove at 4:30. Plain envelope, no postmark. Her name written on the front in a hand that was deliberate and unnatural, someone trying to disguise their writing. She opened it at the kitchen table before the room was fully light. "Leave the ranch. Leave the county. What you think you know will bury you before it buries anyone else. This is the only warning you'll receive." She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the locked box with the notebooks. She started the fire. She started the coffee. She went about the business of breakfast with the mechanical competence that had carried her through harder mornings than this one. When Cy came in at 5:15, she poured his coffee and said nothing. When Calloway came through at 6, she said nothing. She served breakfast, she cleaned the kitchen, she made a list of the week's supply needs. At noon, she unlocked the box and took out the letter and brought it to Calloway's office. She set it on the desk in front of him and let him read it. He read it once, his jaw did the thing it did, he read it again. "When did this come?" he said. "Sometime before 4:30 this morning," she said. "That means someone was on this property." "Yes," she said. He stood up. He was very still in the way that meant the opposite of stillness, something compressed, looking for a direction. "I want to show this to Sheriff Malone." "I think that's right," she said. "But I want you to understand what showing it to him means. It means this becomes less contained. People talk. Once the sheriff is involved, this moves faster." "Maybe that's not the wrong thing," he said. She thought about it. "Maybe not," she admitted. Sheriff Caleb Malone was a compact man in his late 40s who had the watchful patience of someone who had learned, over a long career in frontier law, that most situations resolved themselves more clearly if you let them develop before you pushed on them. He came out to Ridgewater 2 days after Calloway sent word, rode the perimeter of the property with Calloway while Mara made lunch, and then sat at the kitchen table the same chair Cy used, which had silently become the chair guests used, and read everything she put in front of him. He was a slow reader. She had time to assess him while he worked through it. He didn't perform skepticism the way some men did, making a show of doubt to establish authority. He just read carefully, and when he had questions he asked them plainly, and she answered plainly, and he went back to reading. When he was finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The mill logs," he said. "Those are from the mill's own records." "Yes." Cy collected them in person. The mill bookkeeper provided copies of their original weight logs, and the discrepancy between those and Briggs's manifests is $473 over 3 years, she said. "Documented. There may be more in the years before that, but those are the records we were able to obtain." He nodded. He looked at the letter. "This is the kind of thing that tends to indicate someone is feeling cornered," he said. It wasn't quite directed at her, more like thinking aloud. "That's my reading too," she said. "You're planning to keep going," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with the particular steadiness of a man deciding something. "I've had 2 other complaints in the past year," he said. "Different ranchers. Supply shortfalls they couldn't quite document well enough to bring formally. Cattle numbers that didn't reconcile on paper." He paused. "I've been watching Gideon Briggs for a while. I didn't have enough to move on." "You have more now," she said. "I have more now," he agreed. He looked at Calloway. "I'll open a formal inquiry into the supply fraud. That gives me legal standing to request Briggs's records directly, not just the mills." He paused again, longer this time. "The other matter, the land board. The filings that's going to need more than what you have here before I can put it to anyone officially." "I know," she said. "We're still building it." He nodded. He put his hat back on his head and stood up. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "keep the letter and keep that box locked." "I intend to," she said. After he left, the ranch felt different, slightly exposed, the way a thing feels when it's been said aloud that was previously only thought. Calloway moved through his evening differently, more watchful, his eyes going to the windows more than usual. The hands felt it without knowing exactly what had shifted, the way animals sense atmospheric pressure before the weather actually changes. Holt's behavior changed too, though subtly. He'd been quietly distant for 2 weeks, no more hovering near the kitchen. None of the low comments to the other hands that she'd been monitoring from the beginning. Now he was watchful in a different way. He ate his meals without talking. He watched her sometimes, from across the room with a calculation in it that she didn't like. She said nothing. She watched him back when she was sure he wasn't looking. She added entries to the personnel notebook. The community meeting was not something she anticipated. She found out about it through the least expected channel. Drew, the young seasonal hand, who'd heard it mentioned at the feed yard when he went for a load of winter hay. A general meeting of ranchers and community members, called by the county land board, to discuss the water rights framework and the upcoming winter relief measures for drought-affected operations. Scheduled for the last Friday in November at the Clearwater Community Hall. Blackthorn's name was on the meeting notice as a featured speaker. He was presenting a proposal for a community-supported land consolidation initiative, a framework that would allow struggling ranchers to transfer their holdings to a collective management structure, which would then have the water rights, negotiating power, to get them through the drought. She read the meeting notice 3 times when Calloway showed it to her. "He's going to use that meeting," she said. "To do what?" "To present the narrative before we can," she said. "A man like Blackthorn doesn't call a public meeting without knowing what he's going to accomplish at it. He's either going to announce something that makes it harder for us to move against him, or he's going to move against us first. She looked at Calloway. He knows we've been talking to the sheriff. He knows we went to the land registry. Someone has been keeping him informed. Calloway's expression settled into something cold. Holt. Almost certainly, she said. The next 10 days were the most difficult she'd spent at Ridgewater, which was saying something. She worked on the evidence with the focused intensity of someone who knew they had a deadline they hadn't set themselves. She brought Calloway through every notebook, every figure, every connection she'd mapped, making sure he understood each piece well enough to stand behind it. Because she knew it was coming. She could feel the shape of it approaching, the way she'd felt the shape of the Blackthorn scheme from the beginning. And she knew that when it arrived, she could not be the only person in the room who could speak to this evidence. She also went back to the land filing. The amendment to the water rights documentation, the one filed 14 months ago by the land-holding company with the obscured principal officer, had been bothering her since she'd first found it. An amendment like that, filed quietly, with no direct complaint from Calloway's side, should have required some legal basis. She wrote to the county clerk's office with a formal request for the underlying documentation that had supported the amendment. The clerk's office wrote back in 8 days. The underlying documentation was a survey reinterpretation, a claim that the original boundary survey had used an incorrect reference point, which shifted the eastern boundary of Ridgewater approximately 300 yards west of where it had always been marked. If the reinterpretation stood, the Eastern Creek accessed the water rights that were Ridgewater's lifeline fell, outside Calloway's property line. She read the clerk's response at the kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt something that was close to fear. Not for herself. For Calloway. For Cy and the other hands who'd spent years on this land. For the cattle that were surviving a drought year because the Eastern Creek was still there to water them. She took a long breath. Then she opened the notebook and began writing. The survey reinterpretation had been signed off by a county assessor, a name she didn't recognize, and filed through the land board in September of that year, 6 weeks before she'd arrived at Ridgewater. If she hadn't come, if she hadn't looked, if Calloway had kept going through the winter not knowing that the ground was being moved under him legally, by spring he might have arrived at a point where fighting it was financially impossible. She wrote that thought down and underlined it. Then she wrote the question underneath it. Where is the original survey? Not a copy of the original, with the original reference markers. She brought it to Calloway that evening. He read it. He looked at her. The original survey would be...
He stopped.
My father had it. When he filed the original claim, he stood up and went to the far corner of the office, to a chest she'd never paid close attention to, old, heavy, with a padlock that had rusted into permanence and been replaced with a newer one. He opened it. Inside were papers in various states of preservation, folded and bundled. The kind of accumulation that happens when a family keeps everything, because you never know what you'll need. He went through it for 40 minutes. She waited. He found it at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord that had gone stiff with age. He brought it to the desk and unwrapped it carefully, laying out the original survey document hand-drafted, signed and witnessed, with the original reference markers listed in the surveyor's own notation. She compared the reference points against what the reinterpretation had claimed. They didn't match. Not even close. The reinterpretation had used a reference point from a completely different section of the county map, which shifted everything. This is forgery, she said. She said it carefully because it was an important word and she didn't want to use it imprecisely. Not the original survey. The amendment. Someone filed an amendment to your water rights based on a deliberately false survey reinterpretation. Calloway looked at the two documents side by side. His hands were very still on the desk. Can we prove that? With both documents, yes, she said. The original reference points are clearly different from the ones the amendment cites. A surveyor, an independent one, not anyone connected to the county board, could testify to the discrepancy. How do we find an independent surveyor? I know someone, she said. She didn't elaborate. She wrote a letter that night to a man named Harlan Marsh in Denver, who had surveyed 3 properties adjacent to Thomas's farm before his death, and who she knew to be meticulous, expensive, and entirely indifferent to local politics. She sent it with the morning rider. The Friday community meeting arrived before Harlan Marsh's reply did, because the world didn't organize itself around her schedule. She and Calloway rode into Clearwater on a morning that was cold enough to make the horse's breath visible, and the community hall was more crowded than she'd expected. Every ranching family in the county seemed to be there, plus townspeople, plus a row of chairs at the front that held the county land board, 3 attorneys she didn't know by sight, and Victor Blackthorn. She'd seen him once before, briefly, at the feed yard in October. She'd known who he was before she saw him because of the space people gave him the particular radius of deference that gathered around men with that kind of local weight. He was in his mid-60s, broad-shouldered, with white hair and a face that had the open, settled quality of a man who had never had much reason to doubt himself. He wore a good coat. He greeted people by name warmly with the practiced ease of a man who'd been working rooms like this for 30 years. He looked at Mara once when she and Calloway came in, and she had the distinct impression that he had known she was coming and had already decided how to handle it. The meeting began. Blackthorne spoke first, which she'd expected. He was good at it, clear, measured, using the language of community concern and mutual survival that people in hard times were primed to respond to. He laid out his consolidation proposal in terms that made it sound like collective protection rather than acquisition. He named 3 ranchers who had already signed on and were doing better for it, which the 3 ranchers in question confirmed with nods. Mara sat in the 3rd row with her hands folded in her lap, and the expression she'd developed for situations where appearing calm was a form of strategy. And then 40 minutes in, Blackthorne shifted. He said he had a matter of concern to raise before the community. He said it with the careful tone of a man who was reluctant to bring unpleasantness into a room, but felt he had no choice. He said that it had come to his attention that the recent inquiry into certain supply arrangements in the county had been initiated on the basis of records that he had reason to believe, manipulated. He said the word manipulated with just enough weight. He said that a woman employed at the Ridgewater Ranch, and here his eyes went to Mara, briefly, acknowledging her presence in the room with a look that was somehow both apologetic and deliberate, had been presenting what she claimed were documented discrepancies, but that the source of those discrepancies might be the documentation itself. He then produced a document, a printed sheet, which his attorney distributed to the members of the land board and 3 people in the front row. He said it was an examination of the Ridgewater supply accounts that showed irregularities consistent with altered record-keeping, and that those alterations appeared to originate within the ranch's internal accounting system, not with the supplier. The room shifted. She felt it. Not a dramatic thing, just the particular atmospheric change that happens when a crowd finds a new thing to believe, and hasn't quite committed to it yet. She looked at the document when the attorney's assistant passed it through the rows. She'd been wrong about several things since arriving at Ridgewater, but she was not wrong about this. She recognized the format immediately. Column headings, the notation style, the abbreviations they were from the Briggs Supply Company's internal accounting system. She'd seen that format in the original delivery manifests. She knew it, and she knew, looking at the document in her hands, that the numbers it showed did not match any record she had created. Fabrication. Someone had assembled a document in the style of a formal account reconciliation, attributed it to the Ridgewater internal records, and used it to suggest that the fraud ran in the opposite direction from where it actually sat. She also knew from 7 years of keeping Thomas's farm records exactly why the fabrication didn't hold up. And she knew it in the first 40 seconds of looking at it. She stood up. The room was not expecting that. Blackthorne was mid-sentence, beginning to offer what he framed as a path forward, a community mediator, a third-party audit, when she stood up, and the room went quiet, and he stopped. "I apologize for interrupting," she said. She didn't sound sorry. She sounded precise. "But I need to address that document before this conversation goes further." There was a murmur. Someone at the back said something she didn't catch. Blackthorne looked at her with an expression that was professionally patient, in a way that took practice to achieve. His attorney leaned to him and said something quietly. "Mrs. Whitlock," Blackthorne said as if he hadn't known her name. "I understand this may feel—"
"This document is not from the Ridgewater account,"
she said. "It's formatted using the Briggs Supply Company's internal accounting columns. I can show you the specific notation style, which differs from the ledger system the ranch itself uses." She paused. "The figure in column 4 uses a decimal notation that the Briggs Company adopted 2 years ago. The Ridgewater accounts have never used that notation because the ledger they're kept in was set up in 1878 and uses a different format throughout. This document was not produced from the Ridgewater records. It was produced by someone familiar with the Briggs supply format and designed to look official." The room was very quiet. She reached into the bag she'd carried in and produced the actual Ridgewater ledger, the original, which she'd asked Calloway to bring and which he'd brought without asking why. She held it up. "The handwriting in this ledger is Ellen Calloway's for the first 4 years and Ethan Calloway's for the past 3. I've been making entries for 7 weeks. Anyone in this room who knew Ellen Calloway can examine this ledger and confirm the handwriting." At the front of the room, 3 people shifted in their chairs. At least 2 of them had known Ellen Calloway. She knew that because she'd asked Cy before she came, Blackthorne said. steadily, Mrs. Whitlock. "The question is not about the ledger itself, but about whether the records in it accurately reflect." "Question," she said, "is whether the document you just presented to this room is genuine. I'm telling you it is not. And I am prepared to demonstrate that with the original supply records, the mill's weight logs, and the survey documentation that your land holding company filed against Ethan Calloway's water rights based on a reference point that does not exist in the original county survey." The room went very still. Victor Blackthorne looked at her across the rows of chairs and the heads of 60 people who had gone entirely quiet. And for the first time since she'd walked through the community hall door, she saw something flicker behind his composed expression that was not patience and was not certainty. She stood in the silence and held his gaze, and did not look away, and did not sit down, and did not offer him the courtesy of softening what she'd just said. And the room waited to see what he would do. The silence in the community hall lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Victor Blackthorne was a man who had spent decades in rooms like this one, and he knew Mara could see that he knew that the silence had shifted against him. Not completely. Not yet. But the particular quality of 60 people holding their breath had changed from the suspended uncertainty of a crowd waiting to be told what to think into something more cautious, more watchful, the kind of quiet that precedes a reconsideration. He recovered smoothly. She'd expected that, I think, he said, addressing the room rather than her, his voice carrying the measured warmth of a man who was above being rattled, that what we're seeing here is exactly why these matters require proper legal examination rather than public forum. Mrs. Whitlock has clearly worked very hard on behalf of the Calloway Ranch, and her dedication is not in question. What is in question is whether the conclusions she's drawn are accurate, and that's precisely the kind of question that— "I'd like to see the document," said a voice from the left side of the room. Mara turned. The man who'd spoken was standing late 60s, thick through the shoulders, with a weathered face and the particular stillness of someone who didn't speak often in public, but expected to be heard when he did. She didn't know him, but the room did. She could feel it in how quickly the attention shifted toward him. "Jonah," someone said quietly near the front. "Jonah Aldridge." She knew the name. Cy had mentioned him twice, a man who'd ranched in this county for 40 years, who'd lost his wife the previous winter, whose opinion in a gathering like this carried the weight of long tenure and personal integrity. He was not a man who made enemies, which meant he was not a man anyone had expected to stand up. Blackthorne's attorney leaned toward him and said something. Blackthorne put a hand up slightly, a small gesture, almost invisible. That meant, "Let me handle it." "Of course, Jonah," Blackthorne said warmly. "I'd encourage everyone to examine." "Not the one you handed out," Aldridge said. He was looking at Mara. "I want to see what she has." Mara walked to where Aldridge was standing and handed him the Ridgewater ledger. He took it and opened it at the midpoint, looked at the entries, turned back several pages. He was not a man who rushed. The room waited. "Ellen Calloway's hand," he said, "not quite to anyone." Then he turned to the front page and compared it to the later entries. He looked at the document Blackthorne had produced, which someone passed to him. He held both for a long moment. "These don't match," he said. "The column format's different. That's what I said," Marissa said. "I can see that." He handed the ledger back to her and looked at Blackthorne with the level, unhurried gaze of a man who had decided something and wasn't in a hurry to announce it because he didn't need to. "Victor, I've known you a long time." "You have," Blackthorne said. Still warm. Still controlled. "In the past 2 years I've had supply problems I couldn't account for," Aldridge said. "I put it to the drought and to getting old and not watching things close enough. Lost 14 head I couldn't reconcile on paper." He paused. "Briggs was my supplier too." The room shifted again. Mara felt it like a change in wind direction, subtle but total. Blackthorne said, "Jonah, supply issues during a drought year. Are you telling me that's what it was?" Aldridge said, "Because I'd like to hear you say that directly." The pause before Blackthorne answered was brief. But it was there, and rooms like this one noticed pauses. "I think this is not the place." "You called the meeting," Aldridge said. Simple, final. He sat back down. Sheriff Caleb Malone, who had been seated along the side wall and had not said a word since the meeting opened, stood up at that point. He did it slowly, the way he did most things, without drama. He had the kind of physical presence that came not from size, but from the particular economy of someone who never moved unnecessarily. "I'm going to ask for the floor for a few minutes," he said to the room rather than to Blackthorne. The meeting chairman, a nervous man named Hollis, who had clearly not anticipated any of what was happening, nodded from the front table with the grateful relief of someone being rescued. Malone walked to the front of the room. He stood in front of the land board members and addressed the room the way he probably addressed a jury when he had occasion to testify, plainly, without performance. "I opened a formal inquiry into the Ridgewater supply situation 2 weeks ago," he said. based on documentation provided by Mrs. Whitlock and corroborated by records obtained directly from the Casper mill. The discrepancy between what was billed to Ridgewater and what was actually delivered is documented across 3 years. It's not a small number. He paused. In the process of that inquiry, my office identified 2 other ranching operations that showed similar patterns. Both were Briggs supply accounts. Both showed consistent short deliveries over a sustained period. Someone in the back said, "Which ranchers? I'm not naming them today because the inquiry is ongoing," Malone said. "But I will tell you that both of those ranchers subsequently sold their property. And both of them told me, when I spoke with them, that by the time they sold, they had no financial margin left. They believed the drought had done it. They didn't know what I'm telling you now." The room was so quiet Mara could hear the wind out against the hall's timber walls. "I'm also looking at a land filing," Malone continued. "A survey reinterpretation filed against Ridgewater Ranch's eastern water rights 14 months ago through a landholding company whose principal officer has not been publicly identified. The reinterpretation uses a reference point that does not correspond to the original county survey on file. That's a legal matter that will go to the county court, but I want this room to understand that it is under active examination." He looked at the land board. 2 of the 3 members were looking at the table. "If anyone in this room has experienced supply losses they attributed to drought or land complications they couldn't explain, my office door is open," he said. "Starting tomorrow morning." He walked back to his seat along the wall. The room erupted not loudly, not in one voice, but in the fractured, overlapping way of 60 people who had each just received new information and were trying to reconcile it with everything they thought they already knew. Blackthorn stood. He waited for the noise to subside, and when it did, he spoke with the composure of a man who intended to walk out of this room upright regardless of what it cost him. "I want to be clear," he said, "that I have no involvement in any supply arrangement with Gideon Briggs. My name has been invoked today in a manner that I find—" "The landholding company," Mara said. She was still standing. She hadn't sat down since she'd stood up. "The one that filed the survey reinterpretation against Ridgewater. The registered agent is the attorney Fenton. Your land transactions for the past 6 years have also been handled by Fenton. Is that a coincidence?" The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Blackthorn looked at her. For just a moment, a fraction of a moment, the kind that most people in the room probably didn't catch, she saw what was behind the composed exterior. It was not rage exactly. It was the particular cold fury of a man who has never been publicly challenged by someone he considered beneath him, and who is only now registering that he may have underestimated the situation. "I used the same attorney as half this county," he said. "That proves nothing." "You're right," she said. "It proves nothing by itself. Part of a pattern. And patterns, when documented carefully, tend to say things that individual facts don't." She sat down. She'd said what she'd come to say, and she'd learned from Calloway's example that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do in a room was stop talking. Ethan Calloway stood up. He hadn't told her he was going to do this. She looked at him. He was 2 seats to her right, and he stood the way he did everything, without preamble or announcement, as if the decision had been made, and the rest was just execution. "I want to say something to this room," he said, "not as evidence. Just as a man who owns land in this county and has been ranching it for 16 years. People settled. Calloway was not someone people in this county ignored when he chose to speak, which was not often. I hired Mara Whitlock in late September to manage my kitchen," he said. "I expected a cook. What I got was someone who found 4 years of deliberate fraud in my accounts in 3 weeks, documented it more carefully than any professional I could have hired, and did it while running the best kitchen that ranch has had since my wife was alive." He paused. "I want to be honest with this room about something. When my foreman told me a widow from Nebraska was answering the advertisement, a large woman," he said, "traveling alone, I almost turned her away." He said it without flinching from it. "I'm not proud of that, but I want to say it here because I think it matters. Every assumption I made about what she was capable of was wrong. Every single one." The room was quiet again, differently quiet than before. "What she put in front of Sheriff Malone is accurate," he said. "I've been through every page of it. I've verified it against my own records. My ranch has been systematically drained for 4 years. The drought made it worse, but the drought didn't cause it. Someone did." He looked at the front of the room, not at Blackthorn directly, but in that direction. "And I intend to find out the full extent of it, with whatever legal means are available to me." He sat down. Mara did not look at him. She looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap, and she took a careful breath, and she did not let herself feel the full weight of what he'd just said in front of 60 people, because if she did, she wouldn't be able to keep her face where she needed it to be. Later, she'd let herself feel it later. The meeting didn't resolve cleanly. Meetings like that never did. Blackthorn made a brief, dignified statement about cooperating fully with any legitimate inquiry and left with his attorneys, and the crowd broke into the heated, fractured conversations that follow a public confrontation. And Hollis tried ineffectually to call things back to order before giving up. But what Mara knew, watching it all from where she sat, was that the shape of the room had changed irrevocably. Victor Blackthorne had walked in as a respected community figure presenting a community solution. He was walking out as something else not yet convicted, not yet formally implicated, but questioned. And in a community, this small questioned was a different country from trusted. Jonah Aldridge found her near the door as people were filing out. He was a man who moved like he thought about each step before he took it deliberate, unhurried, the kind of movement that came from old joint pain or old caution or both. "You put that together yourself," he said. He meant the evidence. The notebooks. All of it. "With help," she said. "Cy Bridger knows those cattle records better than anyone, and Ethan gave me access to everything I asked for." Aldridge was quiet for a moment, looking at the door through which Blackthorne had left. "I lost a good piece of money when I sold those 2 southern pastures last spring," he said. "I thought I had no choice." He paused. "Maybe I didn't. But maybe I would have had one if I'd known what you know now." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He looked at her with the assessing directness of an old man who has given up on social niceties. "You're tougher than you look," he said. "I don't think that's true," she said. "I think I look exactly as tough as I am. People just don't always see it right." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. He nodded once and walked out. The ride back to Ridgewater was cold and nearly silent. Calloway rode beside her, and neither of them spoke for the first several miles, which was its own kind of comfort, the ease of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill the space between them. When they were a mile from the ranch gate, he said, "Aldridge standing up like that, I didn't see that coming." "I hoped for it," she said. "I didn't count on it." "You hoped for it." "The rumors about me were too specific," she said. "Too shaped. Someone crafted them, and crafted things tend to have seams. I thought if someone with Aldridge's standing was in that room and heard what I laid out, there was a chance he'd recognize something from his own experience. People with that kind of experience don't always speak, but sometimes they do." She paused. "He did." Calloway absorbed that. "You were gambling. I was calculating," she said. "There's a difference." He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, stopped short by the cold air. "Is there?" "Yes," she said. "Gambling is when you don't know the odds. I knew the odds. I just didn't control the outcome." They rode through the gate. The ranch was dark, except for the bunkhouse light and the lamp in the kitchen window that Cy always left burning when they were out after dark. Mara looked at it from the yard, that steady square of light, and felt something she was still getting used to feeling. Not safety exactly. Something quieter than that, the sense of a place that was becoming known to her in the particular way that places became known when you'd fought for them. The following 3 weeks were the hardest kind of waiting, active, necessary, and expensive, in ways that didn't show on a ledger. Malone's inquiry expanded. He sent a deputy to Briggs's operation with formal papers, and Briggs, faced with the mill's weight logs and the manifest discrepancies laid out in legal language, made the decision that Mara had expected from the beginning. He gave up information. Not everything. Enough. He confirmed the supply shortfalls were deliberate. He confirmed he had been directed to conduct them and compensated accordingly. He refused, initially, to name who had directed him, citing concerns for his own safety that Malone told Calloway, with some dryness, were probably not entirely unfounded. The name came eventually not from Briggs directly, but from a second source, a bookkeeper at the landholding company who had been underpaid for 2 years and had no particular loyalty remaining. The principal officer of the landholding company, the name that had been obscured behind the registered agent, was an associate of Blackthorne's, a man named Carver, who had served on the county land board for 3 years and had quietly resigned the week after the community meeting. Carver's resignation, when Malone examined it against the timeline, had been submitted the morning after the meeting, 2 days before Malone's deputy arrived at the landholding company's filing address in Casper. She added it to the notebooks. In the second week of December, Harlan Marsh arrived from Denver. He was exactly as she remembered him, spare, exacting with the slightly irritable manner of a man whose standards for accuracy most people failed to meet. He spent 2 days examining the original Ridgewater survey against the amendment filing, and at the end of those 2 days he produced a written analysis that was 11 pages long and left no room for interpretation. "The reference point used in the amendment," he said to Calloway and Mara, seated at the kitchen table with his analysis spread between them, "does not exist in the original survey. It appears to have been derived from a partial transcription of a different survey document, one from a property roughly 12 miles northwest of here. Whether this was a deliberate falsification or an extraordinary error is not my determination to make. What I can tell you is that the boundary shift it produces is not supported by any legitimate reading of the original survey, and that in my professional opinion, any competent surveyor who examined both documents would reach the same conclusion. Would you testify to that? Calloway asked. That's what you're paying me for, Marsh said. He charged them a great deal of money, which Calloway paid without flinching, and which Mara noted without comment because she understood it was the right expenditure, and she trusted him now to make those decisions without her having to manage his reaction to them. It was a shift that had happened gradually, in the way that shifts between people who work closely together tended to happen not in one moment, but in the accumulation of moments. She had stopped explaining her reasoning before he asked. He had stopped second-guessing her assessments. They disagreed on things. Sometimes sharply he thought she was too cautious about Holt. She thought he was too slow to involve the county court attorney directly, and they said so, and the disagreements got resolved without damage to either of them. Holt left the ranch in the third week of November. He didn't resign exactly. He disappeared one morning, his bunk cleared out. No note. Malone was informed. There was a brief effort to locate him, which produced the information that he'd passed through 2 towns heading south and then vanished from traceable record. Malone thought he'd been told to leave by whoever was managing the exposure. Mara thought the same. She also thought there were things Holt might have told them if he'd stayed and faced what was coming, but that he'd made the calculation that the risk outweighed the benefit, and she couldn't entirely blame him for it. She removed the personnel notebook from the locked box and made a final entry in it. Then she put it back. The county court attorney was a woman named Beatrice Strand, which had surprised Calloway and not surprised Mara at all. She was in her mid-40s, angular and efficient, with the habit of reading documents very fast and asking questions that were designed to find the gaps before the opposing side did. She took the case in mid-December, reviewed everything Mara had assembled, and said 2 things. First, that the evidence for the supply fraud was solid and Briggs would likely face criminal charges as well as civil liability. Second, that the land amendment case was strong enough to take to the county judge immediately, before the amendment had any further effect on Calloway's water rights. The original survey is unambiguous, Strand said. She was sitting at the kitchen table, which had become the de facto conference room for every important conversation that had happened in the last 2 months, and which Mara thought Ellen Calloway would have recognized and possibly appreciated. With Marsh's testimony, I can get that amendment voided. The question is what else we attach to the filing. The full pattern, Mara said. The supply fraud, the cattle record alterations, the timing of the land purchases. All of it. Not as separate complaints, but as a demonstrated scheme. Strand looked at her. You want to go after Blackthorne directly? I want the court to see the full picture, Mara said. Whether that constitutes going after Blackthorne directly is for the law to determine. Strand was quiet for a moment, looking at the notebooks stacked at the end of the table. How many of these do you have? 4.5, Mara said. Strand looked at Calloway. She's right, she said. We filed the full picture. They filed on December 19th. The county court judge, a man named Forsyth, who Strand said was honest, slow, and fair in that order, received the filing and set a hearing for the 2nd week of January. In the interim, 3 things happened. The first was that 2 other ranchers came to Malone's office with their own records. Not the ranchers who had sold those sales were already done, and their legal situation was more complicated. These were ranchers who were still operating, who had heard what happened at the community meeting, who had spent the weeks since going through their own accounts with the same attention to detail that they'd never bothered with before. Both of them had supply accounts through Briggs. Both of them found discrepancies that, when mapped against the pattern Mara had documented for Ridgewater, showed the same signatures, consistent, calibrated short deliveries, sustained over 2 to 3 years. The second was that Jonah Aldridge showed up at Ridgewater on a Tuesday morning in late December, unannounced, on a horse that moved as carefully as its rider. He dismounted in the yard and asked for Mara by name, which Cy reported to her with the slightly surprised expression of a man encountering something he'd expected less than he probably should have. She met him in the yard. The morning was very cold, the sky white and low. I went through my records, he said. He handed her a bundle of papers, a ledger, some loose receipts, a set of delivery manifests. I'm not as organized as you, and some of it goes back far enough that the figures aren't clean. But there's enough there. He paused. I lost those pastures for almost nothing, because by the time I sold, I believed I was in worse shape than I was. If someone put me there deliberately, he stopped. I want that in front of the court, it will be, she said. He looked at her for a moment. My wife would have liked you, he said. It came simply, without the overlay of sentiment that would have made it feel performed. She had no patience for people who looked at the floor. Mara took the papers. Thank you, Mr. Aldridge Jones, he said. The third thing that happened was smaller. and private, and mattered to her more than she'd anticipated. It was a Sunday evening in the last week of December. The hands were in the bunkhouse. Cy had gone to bed early with a head cold. The kitchen was hers, the fire steady. The notebooks closed for the first time in weeks because there was nothing new to add to them, and she'd decided, deliberately, to give herself one evening that wasn't about building a case. She was making a pie, a proper one, dried apple with the spiced filling that Thomas had always said was the best thing she made, which she hadn't made since leaving Nebraska because there hadn't been occasion for it. She was at the work table, the cracked one with the rag stuffed in the seam, rolling the crust, when Calloway came through the kitchen door. He stopped when he saw what she was doing. Something happened in his face that he didn't entirely control, a softening brief and quickly managed. But there, Ellen used to make that, he said, same spice. Clove and cinnamon. It's what the recipe calls for, she said. She made it at Christmas, he said. He wasn't quite talking to her, talking at the edge of the thing, the way people do when a memory is too specific to approach directly. He sat down in Cy's chair. She kept working. She didn't offer him anything or ask him anything. She let the kitchen be what it was, warm, occupied, smelling of cinnamon and wood smoke. After a while, he said, when this is over, with the court and all of it, what do you want to do? She looked up from the crust. He was watching her with the directness he sometimes had, in moments when his usual guardedness dropped not dramatically, just by degrees, like a door not quite latched. What do I want to do? She repeated. She wasn't stalling. She was deciding how honest to be. You have options now, he said. Aldridge said as much that he'd hire you to go through his accounts. Strand told me she thinks you could do what you've done here, for any operation in the county that needed it. You've made a name. He paused. A different name than what you came here with. A different name than the one people were trying to give me, she said. Yes, he said. She finished the crust edge and set the rolling pin down. She looked at the pie tin and then at him. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I haven't let myself think that far. She paused. What are you asking me? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, I'm asking if you're planning to leave. Are you asking because you need a cook? She said. She said it straight, not as a deflection but as an honest question. She needed to know which thing she was answering. No, he said. He said it without hesitation, which was its own kind of answer. She looked at him. He looked back. The fire popped. Outside, the December wind pressed against the glass, the same wind she'd been listening to for 3 months, which had stopped feeling like a stranger's wind somewhere in October and started feeling like something that belonged to the same landscape she was beginning to belong to. Then I'll think about it, she said. She put the pie in the oven. He stayed at the table. He poured himself coffee from the pot she kept on the stove and sat with it, and she cleaned up the work table, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have said enough for one evening and know it. The pie was good. They ate it after it cooled, at the kitchen table, and Calloway said it was the best thing he'd eaten at that table since he couldn't remember when, and she told him not to exaggerate, and he said he wasn't, and she didn't argue further because she thought he might be right, and not just about the pie. The hearing in January lasted 2 days. Mara sat at the table beside Strand and answered questions when she was asked to, and presented the notebooks in the organized, methodical way she'd spent 3 months developing, and watched Forsyth read through Marsh's survey analysis with the slow, thorough attention of a man who intended to understand what he was looking at. Briggs had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced charge. Malone had negotiated it, and his testimony confirmed the supply fraud's deliberate nature and the chain of direction that had orchestrated it. He did not name Blackthorne directly. He named Carver, but Carver's connection to Blackthorne, documented through the land-holding company filings, the attorney Fenton's records, and the pattern of land acquisitions, built the picture that Strand presented to the court with the patient, systematic clarity of someone who had been given excellent raw material. Aldridge testified. He did it the same way he'd stood up at the community meeting plainly, without drama, with the particular weight of someone who had been in this county long enough that his word carried its own authority. He described his losses, his sale, and what he understood now that he hadn't understood then. Calloway testified last. He was not a natural witness. He was too contained, too reluctant to produce the emotional accessibility that courtrooms sometimes rewarded. But what he had was precision, and a complete familiarity with every piece of evidence Mara had assembled, and the credibility of a man who was visibly angry and visibly controlled about it, which Mara thought was probably more persuasive than eloquence would have been. When it was done, Forsyth recessed for 3 days to consider. On the 4th day, he issued his ruling. The survey amendment was voided in its entirety. The original boundary markers stood. Ridgewater's eastern water rights were fully restored and protected. The county land board was directed to review all filings connected to the land holding company for possible irregularities. Briggs was bound over for criminal fraud proceedings. Carver's connection to the filing was referred to the county prosecutor. Blackthorn was not named in the ruling, not directly. The ruling addressed the entities and the filings and the documented fraud, and Blackthorn's name appeared only in the section describing the pattern of land acquisitions listed factually, without conclusion, with the notation that further investigation by the appropriate authorities was warranted. It was not everything. Mara had known it wouldn't be everything. You didn't dismantle 30 years of carefully built power and position with 2 days of testimony and 4 notebooks, no matter how good the notebooks were. But it was enough. For now, it was enough. She sat in the courtroom and heard the ruling and felt not triumph, because the situation was too complicated and too ongoing for triumph, but something that was the legal equivalent of ground becoming solid under her feet again after months of uncertain footing. Strand shook her hand outside the courthouse. Calloway shook Strand's hand. Aldridge, who had attended all 2 days without being required to after his testimony, put on his hat and looked at the sky and said, "Good enough for a start," which Mara thought was the most accurate summary anyone had offered. The ride back to Ridgewater was cold as every ride had been for the past 2 months, and the horses moved at the pace of horses that knew they were headed home. She was tired in a way that went down to the layer below muscle, the kind of tired that came from sustained attention finally being allowed to ease. She looked at the road ahead and thought about the 4 notebooks in the locked box and what they'd cost her to fill and what they'd produced. She thought about the survey amendment, voided now, its false reference points struck from the record. She thought about the Eastern Creek, still running in this drought year, because the underground source that fed it was older than anyone's claim on it, and about what it would mean for the cattle to have reliable water through the winter. She thought about what Calloway had asked her in the kitchen on a December Sunday, and what she'd answered, and what she hadn't answered yet. The ranch gate came into view. Cy had it open. He'd seen them coming from the ridge. He stood to one side as they rode through, and he looked at their faces and read them the way he read most things, and he nodded once. "Good," he said, "that was all." She dismounted and handed her horse to Drew, and walked toward the kitchen door. Behind her she heard Calloway thank Cy, heard the horses being led to the barn, heard the ordinary sounds of the ranch resuming its ordinary business. The kitchen was warm. Cy had kept the fire. The notebooks were in the locked box. The work table had the crack stuffed with the same rag it had always had. She took off her coat and started the coffee and stood in the kitchen that had become, somewhere in the last 3 months without her fully noticing, the most familiar room she'd stood in since she left Nebraska. The light through the window was the flat winter light of January, and the wind was the same wind it always was. And outside the eastern boundary of the Calloway Ranch, the creek was running where it had always run, where it would keep running, on land that was still his, protected now by a court ruling and a voided amendment, and 4 notebooks filled in a hand that Thomas had taught her to keep clear enough to read in court. If it ever came to that, he'd said. It had come to that, and it had been enough. The coffee was still hot when Calloway came through the kitchen door 20 minutes after they'd ridden in. He'd seen to the horses himself, which he did when he needed to think, using the physical routine of it, the way some men used whiskey to slow the inside of his head down to a pace he could manage. He hung his coat on the hook by the door and sat in Cy's chair and didn't say anything for a while. Mara poured him a cup and set it in front of him and went back to what she'd been doing, which was making an inventory of the larder. Not because it was urgent, because her hands needed something ordinary to do. "Strand thinks the prosecutor will move on Carver within the month," Calloway said. "I heard her say that," Mara said. "And Blackthorn," he stopped, turned the cup in his hands. "She thinks he's insulated enough that the direct charges will be hard to build, that the investigation could take a year, maybe more." "I know. Does that bother you?" She considered it, honestly, the way she tried to consider most things. "Bothers me that money can build walls that ordinary people can't see over," she said. "It doesn't surprise me. And no, it doesn't change what the ruling means for this ranch." She paused. "The land is protected. The water rights are restored. The fraud is on record and in front of a prosecutor. Whatever happens with Blackthorn specifically, the architecture of what he built here has been taken apart." Calloway was quiet. She knew that quiet it was the one that meant he was deciding something that had already been decided, and was making himself catch up to the decision. "He'll try to rebuild it somewhere else," he said. "Probably," she said. "Men like that usually do, but not here. Not with this community, not now. And if he tries somewhere else, there'll be a record of what happened here that someone can find." She looked up from the larder list. That's part of why the documentation matters. Not just what it does right now, what it leaves behind. He looked at her with the particular directness he had when he'd stopped filtering himself. You think about things in layers, he said. Most people think about what's in front of them. Thomas taught me that, she said. He used to say if you plant for the season, you'll survive the season. If you plant for the decade, you might actually build something. She said it without the weight of grief, which surprised her slightly. It had been long enough, and she had been busy enough, and Thomas had been practical enough in life, that she thought he would have appreciated the context. He was a good teacher. He sounds like it, Calloway said. He meant it simply, which she appreciated. She finished the larder list and sat down across from him with her own cup of coffee. The fire was steady. Outside, the January wind was doing what January wind did in Wyoming, which was everything in its power to remind you that the territory didn't particularly care about your plans. You never answered my question, he said. From December. I know, she said. I'm not pressing you, he said. But he was looking at her steadily, which was its own kind of pressing. She looked at the table, the cracked seam, the rag stuffed into it. She'd asked Calloway twice about having it repaired properly. He'd agreed both times and not done it. She'd stopped asking, on the theory that the rag was working, and some battles weren't worth the energy. She thought about that now, about which battles were worth the energy, and what it meant that she'd started making those calculations in terms of this ranch, this kitchen, this particular table. I'm not planning to leave, she said. I haven't been planning to leave for a while. He was quiet for a moment. No but, she said. I'm just telling you where I stand, she paused. Where do you stand? He looked at her with the expression she'd catalogued over 4 months, and still didn't have a perfect name for the one that combined the guardedness of a man who'd spent 3 years not letting anyone in, and the recognition of a man who was finding that the door had opened without him fully deciding to open it. I'm asking you to stay, he said, not as a cook, not as whoever manages the accounts. I'm asking you to stay. He stopped. Started over. I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me. It was not a romantic speech. There was no poetry in it, no ceremony. He said it the way he said most things, as directly as he could manage, stripped of anything he didn't know how to mean. She thought that was probably the most honest proposal she could have received from this particular man, and that honesty was not a small thing. She also thought she was going to say yes before she finished the thought, which told her something about where she'd actually been for the past 2 months without quite acknowledging it. You should know, she said, that I am not easy to live with. I'd noticed, he said. I have opinions about things that most people think are outside my concern, she said. I keep records of everything. I will tell you when I think you're wrong, and I will not soften it very much. I'd noticed that too, he said. And I take up space, she said. She said it plainly, without apology, meeting his eyes. In rooms and in kitchens and in conversations, I always have. I've spent most of my adult life being told it's a problem. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was very steady. I'm not asking you to be smaller, he said. I'm asking you to be here. She took a breath, let it out. All right, she said. He nodded. She nodded. The fire popped. Outside the window, the Wyoming wind kept its own counsel, indifferent as always to the interior arrangements of human beings. Later, she would think that the moment should have felt larger. But she'd come to believe, in the years that followed, that the real weight of a decision didn't arrive in the moment you made it. It arrived gradually in the accumulated evidence of living inside it. In the morning, you woke up and it was still the right thing. And then the next morning, and the one after that. They were married in March, when the worst of the winter had eased, but the ground was still too hard to plant anything new. The ceremony was small. Cy was there, and Strand and Aldridge with his hat in his hands and his expression suggesting he'd been right about something he hadn't said aloud. Drew, the young seasonal hand, cried a little, which everyone pretended not to notice. The minister from Clearwater performed the service in the front room of the ranch house. And there was a meal afterward that Mara cooked herself, because she trusted no one else to do it for an occasion that mattered. And Cy said it was the best meal he'd eaten in 15 years, and she told him not to overstate things, and he said he wasn't. The spring was hard. Springs in the Wyoming territory generally were, and the drought hadn't fully released its hold, and there was the ongoing weight of the legal proceedings to navigate alongside the ordinary demands of calving season and fence repair, and the 100 small crises that ranching produced as reliably as the sun came up. But the eastern creek was running, and the cattle had water, and the supply arrangements had been rebuilt through a different company with terms that Mara negotiated herself, line by line, with the company's representative sitting across Calloway's desk while she went through every item and asked questions until she was satisfied. The representative, a younger man from Cheyenne, who had not expected the meeting to go the way it went, left with a contract that was fair to both sides and contained a verification clause she'd drafted herself that allowed for independent weight checks at delivery. He also left, she thought, with a somewhat revised sense of what a ranch kitchen manager was. Malone came out to the ranch in April with an update on the Carver prosecution. Carver had taken a plea, which collapsed several things at once. It confirmed the land filing fraud on the record. It produced testimony about the chain of direction that had orchestrated the supply scheme, and it gave the county prosecutor the documented basis to open a formal investigation into Victor Blackthorne. The investigation was announced publicly in May. Blackthorne released a statement through his attorney, which Strand showed Mara with the slightly satisfied expression of someone who had been waiting for it. The statement denied any wrongdoing and cited a distinguished record of community service. It was the statement of a man who still believed he could weather it. Mara read it once and set it down and went back to what she was doing, which was cross-referencing Aldridge's recovered records against the patterns she'd documented from Ridgewater, because Aldridge's case had taken a direction she hadn't fully anticipated. When he'd brought her his records in December, she'd expected to find enough to corroborate the broader pattern. What she'd found instead was a paper trail that led to a third land-holding entity, different name, different registered agent, but the same structural fingerprints as the first. This one had filed a water rights challenge against Aldridge's remaining property 3 years ago, which had been resolved in Aldridge's favor but at considerable legal cost. She documented it. She brought it to Strand. Strand brought it to the county prosecutor. "You keep finding things," Strand said one afternoon in late April, sitting at the kitchen table with the Aldridge file between them. "The things were always there," Mara said. "They just needed someone to look at them the right way. Most people wouldn't have the patience. Most people haven't spent 16 years running a farm's books by hand," Mara said. "You develop a tolerance for detail." Strand looked at her with the appraising directness she'd had from the first time they met. "I have a colleague in Cheyenne," she said. "A land law attorney who's been trying to build a larger case around fraudulent boundary filings in 3 counties. He's been looking for documented examples." She paused. "What you've assembled, the Ridgewater evidence, the Aldridge records, the Carver plea documentation, that's exactly what he needs." Mara looked at the notebook stacked at the end of the table. She'd started a 5th notebook in February and was halfway through a 6th. "I'd want to maintain the integrity of the original documents," she said. "Certified copies for any external submission. Nothing leaves this ranch without a full copy remaining here." "Of course," Strand said. "And I'd want to understand what the Cheyenne case is building toward before I contribute to it. I'm not handing over documentation to a strategy I haven't evaluated." Strand almost smiled. "I'll arrange for you to speak with him directly." The Cheyenne attorney's name was Abramson, and he came to Ridgewater in June on a day that was dry and bright and smelled of summer grass trying to come back. He was a compact man in his 50s with a precise manner and a habit of listening with his entire body, which Mara respected. She spent 3 hours with him at the kitchen table, going through the notebooks in order, explaining the methodology, answering questions. Calloway sat in for the first hour, and then had to go deal with a fence situation, which was the nature of ranching. The ranch required what the ranch required, regardless of what else was happening. Abramson's case covered 3 counties and involved 6 separate landholding entities that had been operating in a coordinated way over a decade. The pattern Mara had documented at Ridgewater was, as he described it, the clearest and most thoroughly evidenced single instance in his entire case file. "You documented this while managing a working ranch kitchen," he said. "The kitchen had to run," she said. "The documentation happened alongside it." "Did you have any legal training?" "My husband had land disputes 3 times during our marriage," she said. "He prepared for them himself, and I helped him. He had a talent for it. I had a good teacher." She paused. "And I had a brass kitchen scale, which turned out to be the beginning of the whole thing." He left with certified copies of everything, and a clear understanding of what she would and would not permit in terms of how the evidence was used, and the quietly altered expression of a man who had expected something and gotten something larger. The summer brought a change in the drought's grip, not dramatic, not the sudden relief that people prayed for, but a gradual softening. Rain came in July, twice real rain that soaked in rather than running off hardpan. The grass responded tentatively, the way land responds when it's been given something it needed for a long time. Calloway watched it from the porch one evening and said he hadn't seen the east pasture look like that in 3 years. Mara stood beside him and looked at it and thought about the water rights ruling and what it had taken to make sure that creek was still there, to do what the rain was now allowing the land to do. She thought, it compounds. The fraud had compounded against him for 4 years, extracting a little at a time. The restoration compounded, too, the protected water, the cattle through the winter, the spring calves, the summer rain landing on ground that still belonged to him. Couldn't separate the legal fight from the grass they were looking at. They were the same thing, at different ends of a chain. She didn't say that to Calloway. He knew it. You didn't need to narrate things to a man who had lived them. In August, the county prosecutor charged Victor Blackthorne formally. 5 counts, including fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and deliberate falsification of public land records. The news arrived via Strand, who rode out to the ranch in the middle of a Wednesday morning and handed Calloway a copy of the formal indictment with the satisfied precision of someone who had been working toward a thing for a long time. Blackthorne surrendered to the county court the following Monday. His attorney entered a not guilty plea on all counts. The trial was set for the following spring. Mara read the indictment. She read each count carefully, the same way she'd read every document that had come through this process, looking for gaps, for inaccuracies, for anything that would be better said differently. She found 2 places where she thought the language could be tighter and sent notes to Strand, who forwarded them to the prosecutor, who made the adjustments. She filed the indictment in the locked box, which now required a second box alongside it to hold everything. Other ranchers came forward through the summer. Not all of them. Some of the ones who had sold were too far into their new circumstances to engage with what had happened. They'd moved on, rebuilt elsewhere, and opening the wound of what they'd lost, and why wasn't something they had the energy for. She understood that and didn't judge it. Loss did different things to different people, and not everyone healed by turning toward the thing that had hurt them. But 4 ranchers with ongoing operations submitted records to Malone. 3 of them found documented supply discrepancies. 2 found land filing irregularities they hadn't known to look for until they knew what to look for. Malone's office was, as he reported to Calloway with the dry understatement that was apparently his primary mode of expression, somewhat busier than it had been before November. In September, a year after the wagon had come through the Ridgewater gate, Mara stood in the east pasture with Calloway on a morning that was cool but not yet cold, the summer's last warmth still present in the middle of the day. The cattle were in the near pasture. The creek was audible, not loud, but present, the low, continuous sound of water doing what water did when it was allowed to. She'd been thinking about something for a while, and had decided today was the day to say it. "I want to start a records cooperative," she said. Calloway looked at her. "A what? A cooperative?" she said. "For ranchers in this county who want to maintain organized accounts, but don't have someone with the training to do it. Shared system, standardized ledgers, weight verification protocols, delivery documentation. I'd set up the framework and train whoever in each operation was going to manage it." She paused. If ranches had been keeping records this way 5 years ago, what happened here, what happened to Aldridge, to the others would have been caught in the first season. He was quiet, looking at the cattle. A cow moved in the herd, some private grievance with her neighbor. And the neighbor moved away without drama. "That's a lot of work," he said. "I know. On top of everything else you're already doing." "I know," she said. "But I have the notebooks, I have the methodology. Strand can help formalize the legal framework for the cooperative structure. Aldridge has already said he'd participate." She looked at him. "It won't protect everyone, but it'll protect more people than nothing will." He looked back at her. He had the expression she'd come to think of as his version of agreeing. Before he said it's the slight realignment of his jaw, the particular stillness of a man who has checked his argument and found it doesn't hold. "All right," he said. "You didn't even argue," she said. "I tried," he said. "I couldn't find the part you were wrong about." She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhalation. "That must be annoying." "You have no idea," he said. But he said it the way he said things when he meant the opposite, and she knew the difference by now. They walked back toward the ranch house across the dry, beginning to recover grass, and the creek ran alongside them for a stretch. And the sky over Wyoming was the particular deep blue of early September that she'd come to think of as the most honest color in the territory, clear and large, and not promising anything beyond what it was. She thought about Nebraska, about Ruth's kitchen, and the word practical, and the wagon that had brought her here. She thought about Thomas, who had taught her to keep records clear enough to read in court. She thought about the brass scale, still on the pantry shelf, which she cleaned every Sunday out of habit, and which had not been wrong a single time in the 11 months she'd used it at Ridgewater. She thought about the woman who'd ridden into this yard in late September, wide awake and flat, broke in every way that mattered, with a leather bag and a battered ledger training and nowhere else to go. That woman had been 30 years old and tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. She'd been told, in one form or another, by one person or another, that she was too large and too opinionated and too much in general. And she'd carried that with her the way you carried weight you'd given up arguing about, not because you believed it, exactly, but because there was no one around to tell you any different. She didn't want to dress that up into something it wasn't. The truth was that the ranch had needed someone, and she'd been available, and the fraud had been there waiting to be found, and she'd found it because she was the kind of person who looked. It wasn't a story about being rescued. It wasn't a story about finding the one place where she finally belonged, as if belonging were a destination you arrived at, rather than a thing you built with your own hands out of whatever materials the ground gave you. What it was, she thought, was simpler than that, and more durable. You showed up. You paid attention. You did the work in front of you without waiting for someone to tell you it was yours to do. And if you were lucky, genuinely lucky, the kind of luck that wasn't random, but was the accumulated result of showing up enough times and paying enough attention, you found people alongside you who could see what you were actually doing, rather than what they'd decided to see before you started. She had not been lucky her whole life. She'd been lucky here, and she'd made the most of it, and she intended to keep making the most of it, for however long the Wyoming Territory and Ethan Callaway and the East Pasture Creek had to offer. The Records Cooperative took shape through the fall. She drafted the framework herself, with Strand's legal input and Aldridge's practical suggestions, and by November she had 4 ranching operations participating and 2 more considering. She held a working session at Ridgewater in October, sitting at the kitchen table with representatives from each operation and walking them through the standardized ledger format. It was a long afternoon. There were questions, and some resistance, and one man named Garrett who insisted his method was fine and didn't need improvement. She addressed his objections one by one with the patient precision she'd developed over a year of convincing people of things they didn't initially want to be convinced of. By the end of the afternoon, Garrett was the one who asked if he could take a blank ledger template with him to start his own records. She gave him 2. The Blackthorn trial began in the 2nd week of April of the following year. Mara testified on the 3rd day. She sat in the witness box and answered Strand's questions and then the defense attorney's questions, and she was precise and complete, and did not embellish and did not retreat. And when the defense attorney suggested her documentation methods were idiosyncratic and lacked professional certification, she walked him through the methodology in enough detail that by the end of the exchange, the jury looked more confused about why he'd asked than about the answer she'd given. The trial lasted 11 days. Abramson's larger case was not part of these proceedings directly, but the county prosecutor had used the 3-county pattern documentation as context, which meant the jury understood they were looking at a piece of something larger rather than an isolated grievance. The jury returned on a Thursday afternoon in late April. 4 counts guilty. The 5th count, the most complex of the conspiracy charges, the one that required establishing Blackthorn's direct personal knowledge rather than organizational participation, returned not guilty, which the prosecutor had told Strand was the expected outcome given the distance between Blackthorn and the operational details. 4 counts. She was sitting in the 4th row when the verdict was read, beside Callaway, who was very still. Across the room, Aldridge sat with his hands on his knees and an expression that told her nothing and everything. Strand was at the prosecution table and did not react visibly, which was professional. Malone, who had testified on the 2nd day, was near the back wall with his arms crossed and his face arranged in the measured non-expression of a man who had long since stopped celebrating things until they were fully done. Blackthorn received a sentence of 5 years and substantial financial penalties, with additional civil proceedings still pending for the ranchers who had sold. His land holding company was dissolved by court order. County Land Board was reorganized and 3 new members appointed, with a new conflict of interest policy that Strand had helped draft and which included a records review requirement that bore a notable resemblance to the verification protocols in Mara's cooperative framework. She didn't take credit for that. It wasn't hers alone to take, but she noticed it. Walking out of the courthouse into the April sunlight, real spring now, the ground soft and beginning, the kind of air that smelled like things starting over. Callaway put his hand at the small of her back for a moment. It was a brief thing, the way he did most affectionate things, without announcement or ceremony. She leaned into it slightly, the way she'd learned to receive the things he offered, without making him feel they needed to be more elaborate than they were. Aldridge fell in beside them on the courthouse steps. He was moving better than he had in the winter. The warmer months were easier on his joints. He'd told her once, which was the most personal thing she'd ever heard him say. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. They stood on the steps in the April light, the 3 of them, and watched the courthouse square, resuming its ordinary business, people crossing, a dog following someone with hopeful persistence, a wagon pulled by a horse that wanted to go faster than its driver was willing. What happens to the ranchers who already sold? Aldridge asked. He was asking her, which she'd gotten used to. The civil proceedings will determine what compensation is possible, she said. Strand thinks some of them may recover partial value. Not all. It depends on the specifics of each case and what assets remain available after the penalties. She paused. It won't be enough. For some of them, it'll be something. Aldridge was quiet. My 2 southern pastures, he said. I don't expect I'll get those back. No, she said honestly. Probably not. He nodded. It was the nod of a man who had already made his peace with it and was simply confirming the terms. But those pastures won't be used against me the way they were going to be, he said. That's something, as she said. He put his hat on. You coming to the harvest meeting next month? He was referring to a county ranchers' meeting she'd helped organize, a quarterly gathering that had grown, since the fall, from the records cooperative meetings into something broader, a regular exchange between operations about supply sources, pricings, land board activities, anything that affected the county's ranching community. It was not complicated. It was just people paying attention together, which turned out to be more powerful than most of them had realized. I'll be there, she said. He descended the steps and walked toward where his horse was tied, and she watched him go with the particular feeling she'd developed toward him over the year, not quite affection, not quite admiration. Something in the practical middle of both. A man who had lost things and kept going. She knew something about that. She and Calloway rode back to the ranch in the afternoon through country that was greener than it had been. In 3 years, the drought's hold genuinely loosening now. The territory was doing what territory did when the pressure came off, it came back. Not to what it was before it never quite was, but to what it could be given what it had to work with. Thought that was about right. For places and for people. Cy had dinner going. When they came in, he'd taken over the kitchen 2 or 3 evenings a week over the winter, which she'd allowed partly because he was a better cook than he let on, and partly because she recognized the gesture for what it was. A man making himself useful in the home that had become his, in the way homes become yours when you've committed yourself to them long enough. She didn't make a fuss about it. She just ate his food and told him what she honestly thought of it, which he received with the stoic pleasure of someone who'd learned that her assessments were reliable. How'd it go? Cy said, from the stove. 4 counts, Calloway said. Cy was quiet for a moment, his back to them, stirring something. Good, he said. That was all. It was enough. She went upstairs and changed out of the clothes she'd worn to court, and stood for a moment at the window of the room that was now fully, unreservedly hers, the room she'd been shown on her first day at Ridgewater, which she'd approached then with the careful detachment of someone who had learned not to settle in too completely to places that might not hold. It held, she'd made sure it held, and she'd stopped being careful about settling in somewhere around February, when she'd found herself rearranging the shelf in the bedroom without thinking about whether she had the right to, and realized mid-rearrangement that she did. She looked out the window at the east pasture. The light was going gold the way it did in April evenings, and the cattle were moving toward the creek in the slow, purposeful way of animals that knew where the water was. Creek was there. The water rights were protected on paper, and in fact, the accounts were accurate. The fraud was on record, and the man behind it was sentenced. None of it had been smooth. None of it had gone the way she'd planned exactly, because plans and outcomes were always 2 different things. And anyone who told you otherwise had never tried to build anything real in conditions that didn't cooperate. She'd made mistakes. She'd been wrong about Holt's level of involvement, which was probably less than she'd suspected, and more than she'd been able to prove. She'd moved too slowly in bringing the sheriff in, losing weeks she couldn't recover. She'd let herself be rattled by the community meeting in ways she hadn't shown, but that had cost her 2 nights of sleep she'd needed. She was not the person in the story who had done everything right. She was the person who had done enough right, consistently enough, and hadn't stopped when stopping would have been easier. That was the thing about determination, and she thought about this carefully, because she'd watched it simplified into something inspirational and clean in the way people talked about it, which was not how it actually felt from the inside. Determination wasn't a state of being. It wasn't a characteristic you either had or didn't. It was a choice you made repeatedly. Usually when you were tired, usually when the outcome wasn't certain, usually when the next step was harder than the last one had been. You made it because you'd decided that the thing you were working toward mattered enough, and because stopping felt worse than continuing. She had wanted to stop sometimes. In the weeks when the rumors were thickest, and she was hearing her name used as shorthand for something dishonest and manipulative. The night after the threatening letter. The morning before the community meeting, when she'd sat at the kitchen table at 4:30 and looked at the notebooks and felt the full weight of how much she was asking of herself and how uncertain the ground was beneath all of it. She had not stopped. Not because she was extraordinary, because she was the kind of person who, when she decided something mattered, found that she couldn't put it down without losing something she needed. The notebooks were in the boxes downstairs, both boxes now and half a third one. Evidence, methodology, documentation of a fraud that had tried to swallow a ranch and a community, and had failed because one woman with a brass scale and 4 months of evenings at a kitchen table had refused to let it. She was proud of that. In the careful, private way she was proud of things not announcing it, not needing it witnessed, but knowing it was true and letting that knowledge be a solid thing inside her chest. She went back downstairs. The kitchen smelled like Sai's cooking and the last of the day's fire. Calloway was at the table with coffee and the week's mail, sorting it in the methodical way he sorted everything. He looked up when she came in. Strand sent a note, he said. The civil proceeding dates are confirmed. She wants you to look at the documentation package before she files. I'll go to town Thursday, she said. He nodded. She sat down across from him and he pushed the coffee pot toward her without being asked, and she poured her own cup, and the kitchen settled into the particular quiet of an evening that had been waited for and had finally arrived. Outside, the Wyoming spring was doing what it did indifferent, immense, entirely unbothered by the small human story that had played out under its sky this past year. The territory didn't change for anyone. The creek ran or it didn't. The land held or it was taken. The difference between those outcomes was not the territory's concern. It was entirely the concern of the people who stood on it. She had stood on it. She had paid attention. She had done the work. The woman who had come through the Ridgewater gate on a September wagon, sent away by people who saw her as a burden, dismissed before she opened her mouth, mocked before she'd set down her bag, that woman was sitting at this table in an April kitchen, in a ranch house that was hers in every way that mattered, married to a man who had stopped trying to see her in the reduced version and had started seeing what was actually there. The accounts were straight, the water ran. The fraud was answered. She picked up her coffee and held it with both hands, the way she had since she was a girl, the way Thomas had always teased her about, because it looked like she was cold even in summer. She wasn't cold. She was just someone who liked to hold things that were warm, and had learned finally that that was reason enough. It had taken her long enough to get here, but she was here, and she was not leaving.